Yo! Welcome to Supreme Harry. Got an absolute banger for you today. What if Harry found the Peverell-Black marriage contract and inherited the Black Lordship and Death's power at 11? Like, subscribe, comment below. Let's go. Chapter 1, The Iron Box. The cake had 11 candles on it. Harry knew this because he'd counted them through the gap in the cupboard door, watching Aunt Petunia arrange them with the same precise, joyless efficiency she brought to everything involving him. Not because she wanted to celebrate. Because the neighbors might see the kitchen window from the street, and Petunia Dursley's neighbors saw everything. The cake was for Dudley, of course. It was always for Dudley. Harry just happened to share a birthday with his cousin, a fact Aunt Petunia had never once acknowledged out loud, as though naming it might somehow make Harry more real, more present, more permanent in her careful, ordered life. He was 11 today. He didn't feel different. He'd hoped he might. The cupboard smelled like dust and old shoes and the particular kind of damp that comes from being sandwiched between pipes. Harry had lived in it long enough that he'd stopped noticing the smell most days. Tonight he noticed it. Tonight everything felt slightly too sharp, too present, like the world had turned up its own volume without asking him first. He pressed his back against the wall and listened to the Dursleys move through the house above him. Dudley's heavy footsteps on the stairs. Vernon's laugh at something on the television, loud, self-satisfied, the laugh of a man who'd never once doubted he deserved to take up space. Petunia's quiet, clicking heels moving between the kitchen and the sitting room. Harry pulled his knees to his chest and tried not to think about the fact that there was no one in the world who would remember today was his birthday. He thought about it anyway. Then the floor of the cupboard shifted. Not much. Not dramatically. Just a faint, almost apologetic click beneath the thin piece of plywood Harry used as a bedboard, like something small and old deciding it had waited long enough. Harry went very still. He'd lived in this cupboard for as long as he could remember and the floor had never made that sound. He knew every creak, every groan of the pipes, every sound this small, mean space was capable of making. This was new. He moved the plywood aside carefully, trying not to make noise. The floorboard underneath was loose. He hadn't known that, had never noticed it in all the years of living 6 inches above it, and when he pried at the edge with his fingernails, it lifted cleanly, like it had been waiting for exactly this. Underneath was an iron box, barely larger than a hardback book. It was old. Ancient, in the way that certain things carry age not just in their appearance but in the feeling they give off, the sense of weight that has nothing to do with physical mass. The metal was black and deeply cold to the touch, and there were symbols worked into the lid that Harry didn't recognize, a flowing, interconnected design that seemed to shift very slightly when he wasn't looking directly at it. There was no lock. When Harry touched the lid, it opened. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet that should have rotted to nothing decades ago but hadn't, were 3 things. A ring. Black stone set in silver, with a crack running through the stone like an old wound. A second ring. Gold, plain, with a small crest he couldn't quite make out in the dim light from under the door. And a letter, sealed with wax the color of dried blood, bearing an imprint he recognized even though he'd never seen it before, a lily, simple and exact, pressed into the seal with obvious care. His mother's handwriting was on the front. For Harry. On his 11th birthday, if this reaches him. If it doesn't, then nothing else matters anyway. Harry's hands were very steady when he broke the seal. He was surprised by that. He'd have expected them to shake. My darling boy, I don't know how much time I have to write this, so I'm going to say the most important things first and trust that you're clever enough to fill in the gaps. You always were. Even before you could talk properly, you had these eyes that made people feel like you were 3 steps ahead of them. Your father called it the Peverell look. I called it terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. You are Harry James Potter. But you are also, through me, the last male line heir of the Peverell family. I know. Sit with that for a moment. The Peverells were, one of the oldest magical families in Britain. Older than the Blacks, older than the Malfoys, older than most things people bother to remember. The story most people know is that 3 brothers created 3 legendary objects and were each given them by death. The truth is somewhat more complicated and a great deal more interesting, and if you're reading this letter in my sister's house, which I suspect you are, then I'm sorry for the weight I'm about to put on you. The Peverell gifts aren't just the objects. The objects are symbols. What the line actually carries is a relationship with magic itself, an awareness, a sensitivity, a capacity to understand the deeper structures of the world that other wizards can't access. It manifests differently in different people. In your grandfather, it was an ability to see through illusions that no spell could penetrate. In me, it was an instinctive understanding of magic's intent. I always knew what a spell was for, even ones I'd never seen. I don't know what form it will take in you. I suspect it will be something none of us could predict. There's a marriage contract in the box with this letter. It was drawn up in 1754 between Charles Peverell and Peverell-Black, binding the 2 lines through any and all future heirs should the Potter line ever join with the Peverell inheritance. Your father was a Potter, but the magic recognized him as Peverell adjacent through his family's old alliance with our line. When we married, the contract activated. It means that through a rather extraordinary piece of ancestral legal work, you are the rightful heir to the House of Black. Sirius, your godfather, who I hope is alive and free and has already told you all of this himself, because if he hasn't something has gone terribly wrong. Sirius is the current Lord Black, but he named you in his will as his magical heir before you were even born. Combined with the contract, combined with being the last Peverell, you have a claim on that lordship that can be activated the moment you turn 11 and your magical majority begins its first threshold. The black ring is the black lordship ring. The gold one is Peverell. Don't put them on until you've read to the end. I need to tell you something about Dumbledore. Albus is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that, because the magical world is full of bad men, and Albus Dumbledore is not among them. But he is a man who has been certain of his own judgment for so long that he's stopped being able to tell the difference between wisdom and control. He will have plans for you, my love. He has had plans for you since before you were born. Not malicious plans, that's almost what makes it harder. He genuinely believes he knows what's best. Trust your own instincts over his certainty. That's all I ask. The Peverell vault at Gringotts is keyed to your blood. Go there before Hogwarts. Go before anyone else can take you and frame what you're walking into. The goblins will know what to do. I love you more than I ever had words for. I'm sorry I'm not there to say it out loud. Your mum, Lily. Harry read the letter 3 times. Then he sat in the dark for a while and let himself feel the shape of what he'd just been handed. Not just the information, the weight of it. The fact that his mother had sat down and written these words knowing she might not survive to see whether they ever reached him. The fact that she'd hidden them here, of all places, in the floor of the worst room in the house, because she'd known where he'd end up even if she hadn't known why. She knew, he thought. She knew something was coming and he stopped that line of thought before it could pull him somewhere he couldn't afford to go tonight. He looked at the rings. The black ring first. He held it up in a thin sliver of light from the gap under the cupboard door. The stone was cracked, yes, but there was something in the crack that caught what little light there was, not reflecting it so much as responding to it, like the crack was a door slightly ajar. The crest on the band was a shield divided into 4 quarters with a hand holding a wand at the center. The Peverell ring was simpler. Smooth gold, almost warm despite having been in a cold iron box for, how long? Years. Decades, possibly. The crest was 3 objects arranged in a triangle, a wand, a stone, a cloak. The design was so small he had to hold it an inch from his eye to make it out. He put the black ring on first, left hand, because somehow that felt right. The magic that came through him was nothing like what he'd have expected, if he'd expected anything at all. No explosion, no blinding light, no dramatic crack of power announcing itself to the neighborhood. It was more like recognition. Like a door opening in a room he'd always been standing in. The magic of the Black family settled around him the way a coat settles onto shoulders, present and substantial and entirely unremarkable, because it had always been meant to be there. He felt the family. Not people, the family, the weight of the lineage, the old magic that had accumulated over centuries in the Black name. He felt it recognize him. He felt the moment it accepted what the contract already declared, that he was Lord Black, now and properly. Then he put on the Peverell ring. This was different. The Peverell magic didn't settle. It opened. Like a window thrown wide in a room that had been sealed for years. Harry's breath went short for a moment as something vast and ancient and entirely patient turned its attention toward him, not threateningly, not aggressively, but with the specific quality of attention that belongs to things that have been waiting for a very long time and are pleased, in their own unhurried way, to find that the waiting is finally over. He understood, in that moment, what his mother had meant about the objects being symbols. The Deathly Hallows were real, he knew that with a certainty that bypassed rational thought entirely, but they were not the point. The point was the relationship. The Peverell line carried a thread of connection to the oldest magic in existence, the magic that underpinned all other magic, the force that made transformation and creation and destruction possible. Death was not an enemy of that force. Death was a part of it. Harry Potter sat in a cupboard under some stairs in Surrey with the weight of 2 ancient houses on his hands and something vast and patient sitting at the edge of his awareness like a fire seen through fog, and felt, for the very first time in his 11 years of life, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He thought that was probably important. At 4 a.m, when the house was fully silent and the street outside was the particular kind of still that only exists in the hours before dawn, Harry packed his things. There wasn't much. A handful of clothes too large for him that he folded carefully anyway. The letter. The iron box. A photograph he'd found in a dustbin when he was 7, his parents at what looked like a party, young and laughing, his mother's red hair catching the light. He'd kept it in a shoe for 3 years. He left the Dursleys' house through the back garden, over the fence, without a sound. The night bus found him at the end of Magnolia Crescent before he'd even fully extended his one hand. It arrived with its usual explosive bang that made a cat 3 gardens over yowl in protest, and Stan Shunpike stuck his pimpled face out the door looking deeply unimpressed until he registered what he was looking at. A small boy with black hair and green eyes and an expression of absolute, unhurried purpose. "Where to, then?" Stan said. "Diagon Alley," Harry said. "Gringotts." "Gringotts doesn't open till, I know." Harry stepped onto the bus and looked around at the sliding beds and the hanging chandelier that swayed violently as the bus lurched into motion. "It'll open for me." Stan looked like he wanted to argue. Something in Harry's face made him decide against it. The sun was barely up when Harry walked down Diagon Alley, and it looked nothing like the bustling, crowded place he'd been half expecting. In the early morning quiet it was austere and a little mysterious, the cobblestones dark with dew, the shop fronts shuttered, and at the far end of the winding street the white marble facade of Gringotts caught the dawn light and held it. 2 goblin guards stood at the outer doors with the motionless precision of creatures who had not been surprised by anything in several centuries. Harry walked straight up to them. "My name is Harry James Potter Peverell," he said. "Lord Black, head of the ancient and noble house of Black. I'm here to speak with the account manager for the Potter and Black vaults." The goblins looked at him. He looked back. One of them, the taller one, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same granite as the steps, turned without a word and opened the door. Inside, the morning was just beginning to stir. A young goblin at the far end of the hall was sorting papers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who did it every day and found no particular joy in it. He looked up when Harry entered, and the expression that crossed his face was professionally blank in the way that professional blankness has a tell, the slight widening of the eyes, immediately controlled. "Lord Black," the goblin said, because apparently the rings announced themselves to those who could read them. "Griphook will be with you shortly. He is the account manager for both your accounts." "Thank you," Harry said, and meant it. The goblin blinked slightly, as though courtesy in this room was unusual. Harry filed that away. Griphook arrived within 10 minutes, a goblin of middle years and considerable self-possession who managed to look Harry up and down twice while appearing to look at him not at all. He led Harry through a side passage Harry suspected most visitors never saw, into a private meeting room that smelled of old parchment and cold metal and had a fire already lit in a hearth that took up most of one wall. "The rings are genuine," Griphook said, sitting across from Harry and setting a thin folder on the table between them without preamble. "The Black Lordship transfer is clean. The Peverell claim is uncontested, it has been dormant for 40 years, since your grandfather's death, and your blood claim is unambiguous." He paused. "You are aware that you are 11 years old?" "I was aware of that, yes," Harry said. "The Ministry will argue that a minor cannot hold lordship." "The Ministry's argument would be with the magic, not with me," Harry said. "The rings accepted me. The family magic accepted me. I don't think that's something the Ministry can legislate away, particularly since the Wisengamot's own founding charter recognizes blood claim for lordship regardless of age. They just have to appoint a regent for Wisengamot votes until I'm 17. Griphook was quiet for a moment. "You prepared for this conversation?" "My mother's letter was thorough." Another pause, longer this time, and then something that might have been the goblin equivalent of a smile flickered across Griphook's face, sharp and brief and oddly warm. "Your accounts," he said, and opened the folder. The Potter vault was substantial. Harry had half expected that, he'd known, in the vague way children know things without ever being told, that his parents hadn't been poor. But substantial didn't quite cover it. The Potter vault held generations of accumulated wealth, invested and reinvested through Gringotts' own financial management over centuries, and at the bottom of the accounting sheet was a figure with enough zeros to make Harry's eyes want to skip sideways. The Black vault was larger. The Peverell vault, dormant for 40 years, quietly accumulating interest with goblin precision, was enormous. "I would like 3 things today," Harry said, when he'd finished looking at the numbers. "First, I want the details of any and all financial arrangements Gringotts has facilitated on my behalf that I wasn't informed of. If anyone has been drawing from my vaults without my explicit authorization, I want a full accounting." Griphook produced a second sheet from the folder without any visible surprise. Harry read it. The monthly stipend to the Dursleys he'd half expected, Dumbledore's arrangements, according to the coding, which meant it came through a third-party vault, but he hadn't expected the 6-figure sum that had been transferred to educational and care provisions, over the past decade. Educational and care provisions. Harry thought about the cupboard and said nothing, but something settled in him, cold and clear and certain, the way anger sometimes resolves itself into decision. "Cancel the Dursley stipend," he said. "Effective today. Second, I want a copy of every will that has been filed with Gringotts naming me as a beneficiary. Every one." This produced 3 documents. His parents' wills. And Sirius Black's. His father's will was unambiguous on 2 points. 1, that Sirius Orion Black was Harry's godfather and designated guardian. 2, that if Sirius was unavailable for any reason, Harry should go to his father's oldest friend, Frank Longbottom, and under no circumstances to Petunia and Vernon Dursley. Harry read that line twice. "Dumbledore placed him with the Dursleys anyway," Griphook said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." Harry set the document down. "My third request. I want to know the current status of Sirius Black. Incarcerated. Azkaban. Convicted without trial in November of 1981 for the murder of 12 Muggles and the betrayal of the Potter family." "Without trial," Harry repeated. "Correct. Is there a mechanism through which Gringotts can formally notify the Wisengamot that the lord of a noble house is being held without trial? I'm asking whether it's within your institutional capacity, not whether you're willing to do it." Griphook's eyes did something interesting. "There is," he said. "It is rarely invoked. It would require your formal signature as Lord Black, initiating the claim that the House of Black demands review of proceedings affecting its imprisoned head. I'm the Lord of Black, Harry said, and Sirius was the previous Lord Black. I'm claiming that his incarceration was conducted in violation of the charter rights of a noble house. He paused. What would I need to sign? The document appeared from somewhere in Griphook's robes with a speed that suggested it had been ready, which was interesting in its own right, as though the goblin had anticipated exactly this conversation and found it, finally, happening. Harry signed it Lord H.J. Potter Peverell, Lord Black. The signature looked strange on the page. It looked right. One more thing, Harry said, because there had been something in the Peverell vault listing that he wanted to ask about. The cloak. The invisibility cloak. My father's will lists it as being held in trust by Albus Dumbledore. Griphook said nothing. I'd like it returned, Harry said. Through formal channels, with a receipt. Today, if possible. It will take several days, Griphook said. The formal request will need to be issued through, that's fine, Harry said. I have time. He spent another 2 hours in Gringotts. He walked the Potter vault, not the junior vault that had apparently been set up for him, the actual Potter vault, the ancestral one, and stood in it for a while, breathing air that tasted of old gold and old magic, and let himself understand in the most concrete possible terms that he was not a charity case, had never been a charity case, had been made to feel like one through an arrangement so deliberate it could only have been intentional. He didn't rage about it. He didn't have the luxury of rage, not today. He took note of it the way you take note of a debt, precise and patient, and then he went shopping. Diagon Alley was awake and busy by the time Harry emerged from Gringotts at 9 in the morning, and the contrast with the pre-dawn quiet was almost violent. Suddenly there were people everywhere, voices overlapping, owls swooping between shops, the smell of fresh pastries from somewhere nearby competing with the sharp mineral scent of spell reagents from an apothecary next door. Harry moved through it differently than he had any right to, given that he'd never been here before in his conscious memory. The Black Lordship, it turned out, came with something beyond just the legal weight, it came with a kind of social gravity that people responded to without knowing why. Witches and wizards glanced at him and looked slightly longer than they intended to. The rings on his hands caught light in a way that registered, for those who knew what they were looking at, as something significant. He found Madame Malkin's first. The robes he left with were not the standard Hogwarts set. They were that, and also a set of quality formal robes in dark green, and a traveling cloak in black with silver clasps, and casual where that actually fit. The feeling of clothes that fit was so profoundly strange that he stood outside the shop for a moment after and just breathed. Ollivander's was next. The wand maker was exactly as advertised, ancient, odd, precise, with colorless eyes that gave the impression of seeing something several layers beneath your face. He measured Harry in 6 different places and then went into the back of the shop and came back out, and they tried wands for 45 minutes, which was apparently longer than usual because Ollivander kept murmuring to himself in a way that suggested escalating interest rather than frustration. The wand that finally chose Harry was 11 inches, holly, phoenix feather, pliable. When it worked, and it worked, unmistakably, with a warmth that traveled up his arm and settled somewhere in his chest like a coal-catching light, Ollivander stood back and looked at him with those strange pale eyes and said, "Curious." "You said that," Harry said. "I say it when I mean it." Ollivander tilted his head. "The phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand gave only one other feather. One other. And that wand," he paused. "You're carrying something older than my wands, boy. Both hands. Something very old." "Yes," Harry said simply. Ollivander looked at the black ring and then the Peverell ring and went very still in the way that old things go still when they're recalibrating. "The Peverell line," he said quietly. "I thought it had ended." So did everyone else. "The brother who had the stone," Ollivander murmured, as if to himself. "The one who tried to bring back what was gone and couldn't bear the weight of it. Not you, though." He looked at Harry with something that wasn't quite professional curiosity anymore. "What will you do with it?" Harry considered the question seriously. "Not waste it," he said. He bought Hedwig at Elop's Owl Emporium, a snowy owl who fixed him with an imperious amber stare that reminded him, absurdly, of the way Griphook had looked at him when he'd started asking intelligent questions, and decided he approved. She stepped onto his arm with the confident certainty of an animal that had already decided where it belonged. "Hello," he told her. She ruffled her feathers and looked away, which he took as a yes. He was in the bookshop, not just the school list, though he'd got those too, but also a section in the back that held books on wizarding law, on the rights of noble houses, on the history of the Peverell family, when he became aware that he was being watched. A girl, about his age, with wild brown hair and very alert brown eyes, standing 3 shelves away with a copy of Magical Theory and making absolutely no pretense of reading it. She was watching him the way people watch things that don't quite fit the categories they've built, with a slightly furrowed brow that had more fascination in it than suspicion. Harry looked at her directly. She didn't look away, which he found immediately interesting. Most people, when caught watching, looked away. She just shifted her chin slightly and said, "You've been in here for 40 minutes and you're on your 4th stack." "I read quickly," Harry said. "Nobody reads that quickly." She glanced at the stack nearest to him, ancient magical law texts, a history of goblin-wizard relations, 2 volumes on Hogwarts charter. "Those aren't on the school list." "No," he said. She came around the shelf, apparently having made some internal decision. Up close she looked sharp and earnest and slightly combative in the way of very clever people who have been told too many times that they ask too many questions. "Hermione Granger," she said. "Harry Potter." The reaction was there, a slight intake of breath, the very brief widening of eyes, but she moved through it faster than most people would have, which confirmed the impression she'd been building for 40 minutes. "You've got 2 rings," she said. "Lordship rings." "That's," she stopped, clearly doing the mental arithmetic. "Peverell-Black. But you're a Potter." "Through my mother's line and a marriage contract," Harry said. He was watching her with the same directness she was watching him. There's a whole body of law around dormant house claims and minor lordship that most wizarding families never touch," she said. "I read about it. It's fascinating and also quite contentious because the ministry has been trying to, sorry." She stopped herself. "You probably know all of this." "I read most of it an hour ago at Gringotts," Harry said. "What do you think about the ministry's position that age-based restriction supersedes magical acceptance for lordship claims?" Hermione Granger blinked. Then, slowly, she smiled. It completely changed her face. "I think the ministry's position is legally weak and historically illiterate," she said. "The Wisingamot founding charter is unambiguous. That's what I told the account manager at Gringotts." "What did he say?" "He gave me a document to sign." She laughed, actually laughed, bright and surprised, and something shifted between them, the specific shift of 2 people who have just recognized each other as being on the same frequency. "Are you going to Hogwarts this year?" she asked. "September 1st. "Me too." She held out a hand, formal and a little funny given that they were 11 and standing in a bookshop. "Then I'll see you there, Lord Black." He shook it. "Just Harry's fine." "It really isn't," she said, nodding at the rings. "Not anymore. But I'll practice." Hagrid found him at the Leaky Cauldron at noon. Harry had been expecting him, or someone like him, since about 10 o'clock, when he'd noticed the slight increase in attention from various corners of the wizarding public and concluded that word had traveled. He was sitting at a corner table with a plate of food he'd ordered with his own money and Hogwarts, a history propped against a pot of tea, and he looked up when the half-giant ducked through the pub door and scanned the room with the particular anxious energy of someone who'd expected a much harder job. Hagrid's face when he found Harry, sitting calmly, well-dressed, eating lunch, was genuinely priceless. "Harry," he said, arriving at the table with the slightly out-of-breath quality of a man who'd expected to find a lost child and found something somewhat different. You've already been to Diagon Alley." "Most of it," Harry confirmed, closing the book. "Sit down. Do you want tea?" Yeah, Go on then. Hagrid folded himself onto the bench across from Harry with the careful movements of someone very large in a space designed for people quite small. He looked at Harry properly and then looked at his hands and blinked. Those are Lordship rings. Yes. Harry looked at Hagrid steadily. You know what they are. Course I do, I'm not, yeah. Hagrid wrapped his giant hands around the mug the barmaid brought over and seemed to be doing some kind of rapid internal accounting. Dumbledore's gonna want to talk to me about it. Yes, I imagine so, Harry said pleasantly. Did he send you to collect me? Or is this just the standard meet and introduce procedure? Hagrid opened his mouth and then closed it. Both, a bit, he admitted, because Harry was already understanding, was incapable of being dishonest about anything. The honesty was constitutive, woven into him as deep as his bones. Harry found he liked him immediately and straightforwardly for it. I appreciate you coming, Harry said, and meant it. I know it was a long trip and you didn't have to do it personally. Dumbledore could have sent a letter. He let that sit for a moment, the implication that Dumbledore had sent a person rather than a letter for specific reasons. I want you to know that I don't have any interest in making this difficult. I just needed to do this first. Your mum, Hagrid said, and his voice had gone thick. She left you something. She did. She was something else, your mum. Brightest witch I've ever known, and I've known, well. He rubbed his face with one enormous hand. She'd be proud of you. Sitting here, he gestured at Harry in general. Like you own the place. I'd rather she were here to see it, Harry said quietly. Hagrid made a sound that might have been agreement and might have been him trying not to cry, and they sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who have both lost something and recognize that in each other. Will you tell me about her? Harry asked. And my dad. Over lunch. If you want. He paused. Nobody's ever told me about them. Not really. And Hagrid, who had ridden a motorcycle through the night 11 years ago with a baby and a broken heart, leaned forward and started talking. Harry listened to every word. By the time they left the Leaky Cauldron 2 hours later, he had a better picture of his parents than he'd ever had, and Hagrid had eaten 4 plates of shepherd's pie and cried twice and laughed 6 times, and was looking at Harry with an expression that sat somewhere between bewilderment and fierce, uncomplicated love. Hogwarts letter, Hagrid said, producing it from somewhere in his coat. Arrived a week ago, Dumbledore's been holding it. Thought you were still, in the cupboard, Harry said easily. I know. Hagrid's face went dark in a way that suggested his opinion of that arrangement was being strongly recalibrated. You shouldn't have been living like that. Your dad would've, my dad's will explicitly prohibited it, Harry said. I've got a copy from Gringotts if you'd like to see it sometime. The darkness in Hagrid's face deepened and settled into something that looked, Harry thought, very much like the beginning of a long and considered anger. Good. That kind of anger, aimed in the right direction, could be useful. Hogwarts, Harry said, taking the letter. September 1st. I'll be there. He tucked it into his bag. And Hagrid? He looked up. Whatever Dumbledore asks you about today, about what I said or how I seemed, you can tell him the truth. I don't have anything to hide. Hagrid nodded slowly. What are you gonna do, Harry? Harry looked back at Diagon Alley, the bustle and the noise and the magic, his world, which had been waiting for him his whole life while he sat in a cupboard being made to feel like a burden, and then he looked at the rings on his hands, black stone and gold. I'm going to go to school, he said. Learn everything I can. Be exactly who I am. And see what happens. It was, he thought, a perfectly honest answer. He walked back out into the afternoon, Hedwig on his shoulder and the weight of old houses in his hands, and didn't look back at the Leaky Cauldron, or at Surrey, or at any of the life that had been carefully, deliberately constructed around the idea that Harry Potter was nobody worth knowing. He was 11 years old. He was lord of 2 ancient houses. He carried, in the Peverell rings, the faintest thread of something vast and patient and entirely unconcerned with what any particular person thought about it. And he had, for the first time in his life, absolutely nowhere to be except exactly where he was going. Chapter 2, The Weight of Old Names. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. Harry was on the platform at 10:15, which gave him 45 minutes to watch the Wizarding World do what it did every year on September 1st, arrive in controlled chaos, families spilling through the barrier in clusters, owls protesting in their cages, first-years white-knuckling their trolleys while their older siblings performed the studied nonchalance of people who had done this before and wanted everyone to know it. He'd spent the month between Diagon Alley and today at the Leaky Cauldron, in a room Tom the barman had provided at a rate that suggested Gringotts had already sent word ahead, because the rate was very reasonable and no one asked him any uncomfortable questions about why an 11-year-old was living alone in a pub. He'd read constantly, the school texts, yes, but mostly the other books, the ones about law and lineage and the history of things Wizarding Britain had half forgotten. Griphook sent updates twice a week by owl. The formal request regarding Sirius had been received by the Wizengamot. There had been no response yet, which told Harry something about how seriously they were taking it, and that something was filed away neatly for later use. Dumbledore had not contacted him directly. Harry had found that interesting. He stood near the barrier now, watching the crowd, and noticed three things about the social architecture of Platform 9 3/4. First, people clustered by house affiliation years after leaving school. You could tell by the easy familiarity, the casual references, the way certain groups orbited each other. Second, the children with clearly pureblood upbringings moved differently through the crowd, with the unconscious entitlement of people who had been told since birth that this space was built for them. Third, and most interesting, almost everyone who passed close enough to notice the rings on Harry's hands had the same reaction, a moment of arrested attention, quickly controlled, followed by a reassessment of what they were looking at. He watched a family he didn't recognize pass by, parents in expensive robes, a blond boy Harry's age who walked with his chin at an elevation that suggested considerable advance preparation, and the father's eyes caught the black ring and stopped dead for a full 2 seconds before the man smoothed his face back into a polished neutrality and steered his family past without stopping. Lucius Malfoy. Had to be. The resemblance between father and son was pronounced in the way of families who had been selecting for specific traits for generations. Harry filed that away too and stepped onto the train. He found a compartment near the middle of the train, stowed his trunk, settled Hedwig's cage on the rack, and had been reading for about 10 minutes when the door slid open and a round-faced boy with an expression of mild, ongoing panic looked in at him. "Sorry, is it all right if all the other compartments are, I lost my toad," the boy said, delivering all of this as though it were one continuous urgent sentence. "Come in," Harry said, closing his book. "I haven't seen a toad, but I'll help you look if you want." The boy came in and sat down with the relieved collapse of someone who had been tightly wounded for several hours and was grateful for a reason to stop moving. He had a round, honest face and hands that he kept folding and refolding in his lap. "Neville Longbottom," he said. "Harry Potter." Neville's eyes went wide. Then they went to the rings. Then they went wide for entirely different reasons, the first wideness replaced by something more complicated and considerably more informed. Those are," he stopped. Started again. "My gran told me about the Black Lordship claim. She said the Wizengamot was ignoring the petition." "So far," Harry said. "You know your wizarding law." "My gran is wizarding law, basically," Neville said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, something that walked a very fine line between affection and exhaustion. "She knows everyone." She's very," he searched for the word. "A lot," he settled on. Harry smiled. "Is she?" "She keeps my parents' pictures on the mantelpiece," Neville said, and the way he said it was quiet and careful, the way you say things that hurt when you've had long practice making them sound like they don't. "They're at St. Mungo's." "They were. There was a woman, Bellatrix Lestrange, she's in Azkaban now. She and some others, they used the Cruciatus curse until," he stopped. "Sorry. You probably don't want to hear about that." I do, actually, Harry said. If you want to tell it. Neville looked at him with a kind of careful surprise, the surprise of someone who has been told their grief is too heavy for polite company too many times. They don't know me, he said simply. Mum and Dad. When I visit. Dad sometimes, he smiles, like he shook his head. Gran says I should be proud they were heroes. And I am. I just also wish they were home. The train lurched into motion around them, the platform beginning to slide past the window in a slow, then faster, drift. Harry watched Neville's reflection in the glass for a moment. Bellatrix Lestrange, Harry said. She's a Black, by blood. Neville looked at him. Which means, Harry said carefully, that as Lord Black, I have some degree of authority over what happens to the Black family name and legacy. He hadn't decided yet exactly what to do with that thread. But he felt the shape of it, that Neville's grief and Harry's inheritance were connected by a woman currently in Azkaban, that this was not coincidence but the specific kind of structural cruelty that passed for order in the wizarding world. I haven't worked out what that means yet. But I wanted you to know I'm aware of it. Neville looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me that? Because your parents deserved better than what happened to them, Harry said. And because I think you probably spend a lot of time being told to be grateful for things that were taken from you, and I thought maybe it would help to hear someone say out loud that you're right to want more. The compartment was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of silences that mean something. Then Neville said, Gran said you'd probably be, I don't know, different. She didn't know how, just that anyone carrying those two lines would have to be. He looked at Harry with that same careful directness. She said Lord Black is the kind of person who changes things. I don't know if I'm that yet, Harry said honestly. But I'm going to try. The door slid open again. Hermione came in already talking. I've been looking for a compartment with enough room for my books. Oh, hello Neville, Harry, good, I wanted to ask you something. She sat down across from them and produced a piece of parchment from her bag with the decisive energy of someone who had been waiting to have this conversation since Diagon Alley. The petition to the Wisengamot. I've been reading about the precedents for minor lordship, and the strongest case you have is actually through the 1612 Hogsmeade Accord rather than the founding charter, because the founding charter has a modification clause that the ministry has used before to argue. I know about the modification clause, Harry said. Griphook and I went through it. The Hogsmeade Accord is one of 3 pillars. The other 2 are the Blood Acceptance Doctrine and the 1843 Rosewood Decision. Hermione stared at him. The Rosewood Decision isn't in any of the standard references. I found it in an archive footnote. Griphook found it. I want to meet your account manager, Hermione said immediately. I can arrange that, Harry said, because it was true and also because watching Hermione Granger meet Griphook was something he was now genuinely interested in witnessing. Neville was looking between them with an expression of someone watching a tennis match for the first time and being uncertain whether to be impressed or concerned. Are you both always going to be like this? He said. Probably, Harry and Hermione said, at the same moment, and then looked at each other with the shared amusement of people who have just confirmed a suspicion. Good, Neville said, with quiet certainty, and reached into his bag. I've got chocolate frogs. They ate chocolate frogs and talked for most of the journey north, about magic, about Hogwarts, about the things they'd read over summer. Hermione had read everything. Neville knew plants with the relaxed authority of someone who had grown up among them and found them more comfortable than most people. Harry asked questions and listened to the answers with complete attention, and by the time the light outside had shifted to the long, lowering gold of Scottish late afternoon, the 3 of them had the particular ease of people who have skipped the performative stages of friendship and gone straight to the real version. The compartment door slid open a 3rd time, and this one was different. Draco Malfoy came in with 2 large boys who served an obvious bodyguard function despite being 11 years old, which said something pointed about how he'd been raised. He looked at Neville first with a dismissive flick of the eyes, then at Hermione with the particular blank non-expression that indicates a prejudice too ingrained to bother performing, and then at Harry, and his expression did something more complicated. The rings stopped him. Just for a moment. "Potter," he said, recovering smoothly. "I heard you were on the train. I wanted to introduce myself. Draco Malfoy." A pause, deliberate. "I can show you which families are worth knowing at Hogwarts." Harry looked at him with genuine, unhurried interest. Not hostility, not dismissal. Just, assessment. The kind that takes its time. "Which families are worth knowing," he said, as if the phrase itself was the interesting part. Draco's chin came up slightly. "There are old families and new ones. Families that have maintained their standards, and families that haven't. You carry old names, Potter. You'd understand." "I carry old names," Harry agreed. "The Peverells go back further than the Blacks, further than the Malfoys, further than almost anyone in Britain. You know what they cared about?" "Power," Draco said immediately. "Magic," Harry said. "The actual understanding of it. The study of it. They didn't particularly care about blood status because they were too busy being interested in the magic itself." He glanced at Hermione without making it pointed. "My mother was Muggle-born. She was also, by any reasonable assessment, one of the finest magical minds of her generation. The magic agreed with her on that, which is why I'm sitting here wearing 2 Lordship rings." He looked back at Draco. "I'm not trying to insult you. But I think the framework you were handed about what makes someone worth knowing might have some gaps in it." The 2 large boys looked at each other. Draco's jaw had tightened in a way that suggested he was angrier than he was going to show. But underneath the tightness there was something else, a flicker of something almost uncomfortable, like a thought that didn't quite fit the space it was in. "The sorting will be interesting," Draco said, and it was almost graceful, the way he retreated from the exchange without making it a retreat. Almost. He left. The door slid shut. "That could have gone worse," Neville offered. "It'll go differently next time," Harry said. He wasn't sure yet whether he meant better or worse, but he meant differently. He'd seen the flicker behind Draco's eyes, the one that said the argument had landed somewhere, even if the boy wasn't ready to acknowledge it. That was something. Hogwarts appeared out of the dark like a promise kept. Harry was in one of the first boats across the lake, and he watched the castle come closer over the black water with the specific quality of attention he'd been developing all summer, not the stunned wonder of the child he was supposed to be, but something quieter and more grounded. "Here it is," he thought. "Here's where it starts." It was extraordinary. He gave himself permission to acknowledge that straightforwardly. The towers against the dark sky, the lights in the windows, the magic so old and dense in the stones that even the lake's surface seemed to carry it, reflecting the castle back at itself in rippling light. Beside him in the boat, Hermione was gripping the sides with white-knuckled hands and staring upward with an expression of pure, transparent awe that she clearly wasn't trying to hide, and Harry thought she was right to wear it. Some things deserved that response. Neville, on his other side, was also staring up. "Every year my gran makes it sound like a test," he said quietly. "I keep forgetting it's supposed to be home," Harry said. Neville looked at him. "Yeah." McGonagall met them in the entrance hall. Harry had read about her, more than the standard school references, the actual history, the record she'd built over 40 years of teaching. She was precisely what the record suggested, a woman whose standards were high because she believed people were capable of meeting them, which made the high standards a form of respect rather than cruelty. She looked at the cluster of first years with the professional composure of someone who had done this 40 times and still believed it mattered. Her eyes found him in the crowd. She had the same reaction to the rings that everyone did, but hers was interesting. It was not surprise exactly, more the look of someone seeing a thing they'd been told to expect, finally materializing. She held his gaze for a moment, gave a very small nod, and moved on to address the group. The wait outside the great hall was the specific kind of anxious that happens in the throat. Around him, first years whispered theories about the sorting. The ghost, nearly headless Nick, floated through a wall and was met with a chorus of alarm. Harry watched a girl named Lavender Brown try to reassure herself by listing possible sorting criteria out loud, and watched a boy named Dean Thomas who was listening with the carefully blank expression of someone who had no idea what was going on but wasn't going to say so, and thought that the wizarding world had a remarkably poor orientation system for Muggleborns. "Line up," McGonagall said, reappearing. "Single file. We're ready." The doors opened. The great hall was better than the description. The ceiling, enchanted to reflect the night sky outside, which was clear and thick with stars, made the room feel not like an indoors at all but like standing in a space balanced on the edge between shelter and wilderness. The candles floated. The 4 house tables stretched the length of the room and were full. All the older students turned to watch the procession of new ones with varying degrees of interest. Harry walked down the aisle between Gryffindor and Hufflepuff and kept his eyes forward and noticed, with the ambient awareness that had been sharpening since he'd put on the rings, several things at once. Dumbledore, at the head table, watching him with an expression of careful attention that was almost entirely concealed behind a pleasant smile. The smile reached his eyes, it always reached his eyes, apparently, even when it shouldn't. That was a skill, and not a benign one. Snape, 3 seats to Dumbledore's left. Snape's reaction to seeing Harry was the most nakedly complicated thing Harry had observed all day, a flash of something raw and almost painful crossing his face before the man had locked it down behind a wall of cold, deliberate blankness. Harry didn't know what that was about yet. He would. And something else, something his Peverell awareness flagged before his conscious mind caught up, there was a teacher at the far end of the head table wearing a turban who felt wrong. Not wrong the way a person is wrong when they've done something bad. Wrong the way a thing is wrong when it contains something it's not supposed to contain. Like a room that smells of smoke with no fire visible. Harry noted it, filed it, kept walking. The sorting hat was placed on a stool. It sang its song. Harry watched the hat with more interest than most of the students around him, because a hat that sorted children into houses for 1,000 years was a hat that had seen more of humanity's variety than almost any other observer in Britain, and that kind of experience made for a perspective worth having. Abbott, Hannah. The sorting began. Harry watched his new classmates go forward one by one and tried to read them the way the hat might. Hermione, he predicted correctly, Gryffindor. She marched up, sat down, and the hat barely touched her head before calling it. She walked to the Gryffindor table with a beam that she was only partially controlling. Neville was harder. The hat sat on his head for almost 2 minutes, long enough that the hall had gone from politely interested to genuinely curious, and then called Gryffindor. Neville walked to the table looking surprised in a way that Harry thought was heartbreaking, as though the house of his parents and his family was something he hadn't expected to earn. Draco Malfoy sat down and the hat had barely made contact before it shouted, "Slytherin," to what sounded like satisfied applause from the Slytherin table. Potter, Harry. The hall went still in a way the other names hadn't produced. Harry walked to the stool, sat down, and the hat came down over his head. "Well," said a voice in his ear. It was old and dry and carried the specific quality of amusement belonging to things that have seen everything and still find some things surprising. "I wasn't expecting this." "What were you expecting?" Harry asked. "The boy from the prophecy. Brave and loyal and talented but essentially, readable. What you are is considerably more layered." "Is that a problem?" "Not for me. I am not in the habit of being surprised, but I find I don't mind it." The hat seemed to be, not rifling through his thoughts exactly, more like reading the shape of them, the architecture underneath. 2 houses. Death's own inheritance. A month of deliberate, systematic self-education. And no fear. That's what's unusual, actually. Every child I've sorted has something they're afraid of. Even the bravest ones. You have concerns. Plans. Awareness. But not fear. "I'm afraid of things," Harry said honestly. "I'm afraid of wasting what I've been given. I'm afraid of being so focused on the big things that I miss the people next to me. Those feel more real to me than Voldemort. The name doesn't unsettle you. Why would it? He's what happens when the big things go wrong. He's a consequence, not a beginning. The hat was quiet for a moment. You do well in Slytherin. The strategy, the patience, the understanding of power's mechanics. Ravenclaw would suit the mind you're building. Hufflepuff would give you the loyal foundation you'll need. And Gryffindor? Gryffindor would give you the people you're already choosing, the hat said, and there was something gentle in it. The brave ones. The stubborn ones. The ones who need someone to believe in them before they believe in themselves. And frankly, the hat's voice shifted slightly, you are your mother's son. She was Gryffindor to her bones and she put every ounce of it into you. Harry felt the truth of that in a way that bypassed argument. Then that's your answer, he said. Gryffindor. The hat bellowed. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry set the hat back on the stool and walked to the table and sat next to Hermione, who slid along the bench to make room with the air of someone who had already arranged this in her head. Neville was on his other side and grinned at him in a way that crinkled his whole face. Across the hall, Draco Malfoy was watching him from the Slytherin table with an expression that had moved past the simple antagonism of the train and into something more complicated. Something that, Harry thought, looked almost like reluctant interest. At the head table, Dumbledore was applauding with everyone else, and his eyes were on Harry, and they were not as unreadable as he probably thought they were. The feast was extraordinary in the way that food is extraordinary when you have spent the formative years of your life eating what other people didn't want. Harry ate well and listened to the conversations around him with the same ambient attention he'd been applying to everything, building a map of the people in this room the way you build a map of a new city, which streets go where, which ones are shortcuts, which ones look good but lead nowhere. Percy Weasley, the Gryffindor prefect, delivered a welcome speech that was slightly longer than necessary. The Weasley twins, identical, red-headed, with the particular bright-eyed quality of people who find everything funnier than the people around them, caught Harry watching them at one point and both raised their goblets in a small, ironic toast. Harry raised his back. They looked delighted. Ron Weasley, sitting nearby with slightly too much food in his mouth, was attempting to explain Quidditch to Hermione, who was asking questions at a rate that was clearly outpacing Ron's ability to answer them without swallowing first. You should read Quidditch Through the Ages, Harry said to Hermione over Ron's head, and Ron turned to look at him properly for the first time, that specific look people give when they're deciding whether they like you. Harry met it straight on. Ron Weasley had an open, freckled face with honest eyes that were doing that calculation, famous person, or actual person. Harry was familiar with the calculation by now. He waited for Ron to run it. You're Harry Potter, Ron said. Yes. Fred and George said you were already different. On the train. They asked around. He wasn't trying to be rude, he was being direct in the way of people who haven't yet learned that directness is considered impolite by people with something to hide. They said you seem like you already know where everything is. I did some reading, Harry said. Ron looked at the rings. Back at Harry's face. What's it like? Having all that, he moved his hand in a gesture that encompassed the rings and the lineage and presumably everything else. Did you know before today? Since my birthday, Harry said. July 31st. And you weren't terrified? Harry thought about it honestly. I was sitting in a cupboard on my birthday when I found out, he said. Being told I was lord of 2 ancient houses felt better than sitting in the cupboard. Ron processed this. Fair, he said finally. He reached for another chicken leg. You're sitting next to Hermione. I know. She's going to want to study with you all the time. Good. She's brilliant. Ron started, stopped, looked at Hermione, who was now interrogating Percy about the house point system with the relentless efficiency of someone cataloging a new set of rules. Yeah, he said, in a tone that tried to be reluctant and didn't quite make it. She kind of is. After the feast, as the first years were being led upstairs by Percy, Harry paused at the edge of the great hall and looked back at the head table. Snape was still there, watching him, and this time Harry looked back and held it for a moment, not a challenge, just the same unhurried steadiness. Snape's expression flickered. Then he looked away. Dumbledore was speaking to McGonagall, but his eyes, briefly, met Harry's across the room. He smiled. It was warm and genuine and accomplished, and Harry smiled back with the same quality and thought, "I see you. And you know I do. Let's both take note of that." Then he followed Percy up the stairs. The Gryffindor common room was everything. Red and gold and warm firelight and the comfortable organized chaos of a space that had been lived in by a great many people who all cared about it. Harry stood in the entrance for a moment and took it in, the squashy armchairs, the notice board covered in slightly overlapping papers, the older students already settled back into their routines. Hermione immediately located the position of the bookshelves. Neville moved toward the window seat near the fire with the instinct of someone identifying a safe space. Ron dropped into an armchair with the confidence of a person who had been hearing about this room his whole life and found it exactly as advertised. Harry sat in a chair by the fire and felt the wards settle around the castle, felt them the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, that same ambient, whole-body awareness. Hogwarts was alive in the way that places become alive when enough magic and time have saturated their stones. He could feel the boundaries of it, the way you can feel the edges of a room in the dark. And within those wards, a faint echo of something wrong, located, directional. The turban-wearing professor from the head table, 3 floors down and several corridors over. Not a danger tonight. But a problem that was going to need resolving. You all right? Hermione was looking at him with the perceptive precision she brought to everything. Just getting my bearings, Harry said. What do you feel? He looked at her. She was asking it seriously, as though she'd read somewhere that the Peverell gifts were sensory and wanted to understand the data. Like I know where everything is, he said honestly. And like some of it is going to need dealing with. Hermione nodded slowly. The professor at the end of the table. With the turban. Harry looked at her sharply. You felt it? I didn't feel anything. But he was the only person at the head table looking at you with. She paused, precise about it. Fear, she said. The others were curious. Dumbledore was calculating. Snape was, doing something more complicated. But the turban professor was afraid. Of you specifically, not of the situation. Harry looked at the fire for a moment. Quirrell, he said. Defense against the dark arts. He was afraid of your rings, Hermione said. Or what they represent. Harry thought about what things might be afraid of what the Peverell rings represented and said nothing, because he had a good enough hypothesis and it needed confirming before he said it out loud, and he didn't want to alarm people on the first night, and also he had been 11 years old for exactly 61 days and the problems would still be there in the morning. We should sleep, he said. Obviously, Hermione said, but she was still watching him with that careful attention, cataloging and cross-referencing. And he thought that she had almost certainly already arrived at the same hypothesis and was also choosing not to say it out loud. He liked her very much. Neville was already halfway asleep in the window seat. Harry walked over and shook his shoulder gently. Bed, Harry said. Neville said. Yeah. He got up with the slow machinery of the nearly asleep and headed toward the dormitory stairs, and then stopped and turned back. Harry. The thing you said. On the train. About deserving more. He looked at his hands. I've been thinking about it since. He looked up. I'm going to try to be better. At magic. At, I don't know. Standing up. I'm going to try. You don't need to try to be better, Harry said. You're already good. You just need to stop assuming everyone else's opinion of you is more accurate than your own. Neville looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, quiet and significant, the way tectonic things shift. Right, he said. He went upstairs. Harry sat back down by the fire and let the castle breathe around him, feeling the weight of his first day in the place that was, he understood now with a certainty that needed no support, absolutely and completely home. On his left hand, the black ring was worn. On his right, the Peverell ring hummed with something low and patient and old. Outside, the Scottish sky was clear and the stars were out, and somewhere in the depths of the forest at the edge of the ground something moved through the darkness with the easy authority of a creature who knows it belongs to the night, and the castle's wards noted it and let it be, and Harry, half following the castle's awareness, noted it too. He stayed by the fire until the common room was empty and the only sound was the settling of old stones and the occasional spark from the hearth. Then he went to bed, and slept without dreaming, and in the morning everything would begin in earnest. Chapter 3, What Death Leaves Behind. The dream started on the third night. Not nightmares. Harry was precise about the distinction when he turned it over in his mind the next morning, sitting on the window seat in the dormitory while Ron and Neville slept and the sky outside shifted from black to the deep, particular blue that exists only in the 20 minutes before dawn. Nightmares had a texture of threat to them, a quality of being chased. These were different. These were more like, receiving. In the dream he stood in a place that wasn't a place, or was all places at once, a space with no fixed geometry, and things moved through it with the unhurried patience of traffic on a very old road. Not people exactly. More like the shape of people, the essential distillate of what a person is once everything incidental has been stripped away. They moved past him in a direction he couldn't name, and they didn't stop, and they didn't seem distressed. The road, if it was a road, was well-traveled and well-kept and far older than anything Harry had words for. And at the edges of the dream, just beyond the limit of perception, something watched him with the focused attention of a teacher observing a student who has, finally, started to understand. He woke up feeling rested in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He sat with it on the window seat and watched Hogwarts grounds emerge from the dark below, the lake going silver, the forest still a solid mass of shadow, the edge of the Quidditch pitch visible in the distance, and understood, with the quiet certainty that the Peverell gifts seemed to prefer over dramatic revelation, that the dreams were instruction. Not handed to him from outside. More like a door opening to a room that had always been there, a room his mind was now, for the first time, capable of entering. He was learning, in his sleep, to see the way death saw. He had opinions about this. Most of them were complicated and could wait. Classes started on Thursday. Transfiguration first, which was McGonagall, who walked in as a cat and transformed mid-stride into a person without breaking her forward momentum and proceeded to deliver a lecture on the foundational theory of transfiguration with the brisk, layered efficiency of someone who had explained these concepts 300 times and had refined the explanation until it was essentially perfect. Harry took notes that were half theory, half questions, the margins filling with connections to things he'd read over summer. Beside him, Hermione's notes were comprehensive to the point of being their own textbook. McGonagall paused at Harry's desk on her circuit of the room, looked at his notes, and said nothing, which from McGonagall, Harry was learning, constituted significant positive feedback. The match-to-needle transfiguration, she said to the class. You'll find the principle simpler than the execution. Focus on the object's essential nature, not its surface appearance. Harry had thought about this before McGonagall said it, had thought about it the way he thought about most magic, trying to see the structure underneath rather than memorizing the mechanics on top. He looked at the match on his desk and thought not needle but purpose. What a match was for versus what a needle was for. The movement between them felt less like forcing and more like translation. It turned silver on the first try. Perfectly, completely, a clean transformation to the tip. Around him, the rest of the class was producing various stages of partial matches with singed edges. McGonagall picked up Harry's needle, examined it, set it down. 5 points to Gryffindor, she said, and moved on, which was exactly the right response, acknowledgement without fanfare, because fanfare would have embarrassed both of them. How did you do that? Ron demanded, in a whisper that was several notches too loud for whisper classification. I thought about what it was trying to be rather than what I wanted it to look like, Harry said. Ron stared at his match. That makes no sense. Think about what a needle does that a match can't, Harry said. Once you see the difference, the magic finds the middle on its own. Ron looked skeptical, applied it, and got a match with a slightly metallic sheen that was at least 40% more needle than it had been 30 seconds ago. He looked at it with an expression caught between frustration and revelation. Hermione's transformation was complete within the minute, and she and Harry exchanged a brief glance of mutual satisfaction that Ron caught and pretended to find annoying. Charms with Flitwick was pure pleasure. The man was so genuinely delighted by magic, by the actual magic, the mechanics of it, the beauty of it, that his classes had the quality of enthusiasm being conducted rather than information being delivered. Harry liked him immediately. When Flitwick demonstrated the basic wand movement for Wingardium Leviosa, he did it with a flourish that wasn't performance, just joy, and Harry thought that was a rare and valuable thing. Potions was going to be a problem. Not the subject. Harry had read ahead in the potions text and found the subject genuinely fascinating, the way chemistry and magic overlaid each other, the way intention modified chemical processes, the way the same ingredients could produce entirely different results depending on the emotional state and focus of the person preparing them. This was interesting. This had the same deep structure that good magic always had. Snape was the problem. Not an obstacle. More, a complexity that needed navigation. He swept into the dungeon classroom with the particular theatrical energy of someone who had made an art of entrances, black robes moving, and began his first lecture in a register that was pitched somewhere between seduction and contempt, and Harry listened to the actual content of the lecture, which was excellent, structured and demanding and expecting genuinely high standards, while simultaneously watching the way Snape moved through the room. Potter. Snape stopped in front of Harry's desk, and the room went very quiet in the way rooms do when a teacher is about to demonstrate something at someone's expense. Harry looked up and met Snape's eyes. Our new celebrity. The pause was orchestrated. Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? A sleeping draught known as the draught of living death, Harry said. Extraordinarily powerful. The potency depends heavily on the harvesting season of the asphodel root, because the alkaloid concentration peaks in autumn. Most commercial preparations use spring-harvested root, which is why most commercial preparations are significantly less effective than the theoretical maximum. Snape's face did something very controlled. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? The stomach of a goat, most reliably, though the stomach of a mountain goat produces a higher quality stone. It's used as an antidote to most poisons because it works on the same principle as activated charcoal in Muggle medicine, general adsorption rather than targeted antidote. Useful because it doesn't require knowing what the specific poison is. A muscle in Snape's jaw moved. What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? There isn't one. They're the same plant. Aconitum. Also called aconite. The different names come from different regional traditions rather than different botanical classifications. Harry paused. Though the Hogwarts text lists them as separate ingredients in the first chapter, which is an error. I wasn't sure whether to mention it. The room was very, very quiet. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Harry held the look without aggression, without performance, just steady and present and entirely comfortable with the silence. 5 points from Gryffindor, Snape said, for correcting the textbook without being asked for your editorial opinion. Of course, Harry said pleasantly. He kept his face still with considerable effort, not because he was upset, he wasn't, particularly, but because he was working something out in real time. Snape had started the questioning as a performance of Harry's expected ignorance. Harry's answers had deprived him of the performance. The 5-point deduction was not about the answers. It was about Snape recalibrating. He needed a moment to do that, and this was the mechanism he'd reached for. Harry thought about what the man's face had looked like in the Great Hall the first night. That flash of rawness, quickly sealed. There was something complicated between Snape and himself that predated today and probably predated Harry's own memory. He filed it carefully. The rest of the class proceeded without direct incident. Harry's potion was precise. Not showy about it, precisely measured, exactly timed, producing the required color with no flourish. Hermione's was the same. Snape gave them no further attention, which Harry thought was probably deliberate and also a form of acknowledgement. Walking out of the dungeon afterward, Neville fell into step beside Harry with an expression that was somewhere between relief and suppressed outrage. He took 5 points. I know. For being right. I know. He was expecting me to look ignorant, Harry said quietly. When I didn't, he needed something to recover the dynamic he'd planned. 5 points was him buying time. I don't actually mind. He looked at Neville. How was your potion? Neville's expression shifted. He told me to reread the instructions, he said, in a flat voice. In front of everyone. Harry stopped walking. Several students moved around them in the corridor, the traffic of the between-class rush flowing past. Neville. What did your potion look like at that point? It was, I think I added the porcupine quills at the wrong, what color was it? Pale blue, but it was supposed to be, pale blue is correct for that stage of preparation, Harry said. A pale blue at the 10-minute mark means your timing was exact. He told you to reread the instructions because you looked uncertain, not because your potion was wrong. He watched Neville process this. Don't let him convince you that you're less capable than you are. Your potion was fine. Neville stared at him. You were watching my cauldron. I was watching everyone's, Harry said simply, because it was true and not particularly remarkable. Yours was good. Something straightened in Neville's posture. Incrementally, quietly, but definitely. Okay, he said. Right. Right, Harry said. It was during the 4th day that Harry found the vault. He'd been aware of the library's restricted section in the way he was aware of most things in the castle, a slightly different quality of the wards around it, the way a locked room affects the air of a corridor. But the vault was something else. Something older and considerably more concealed, located in a part of the library's substacks that Madame Pants did not appear to visit with any regularity, behind a shelf of 15th-century herbology texts that had not, based on the dust, been touched in decades. He found it by following the Peverell awareness. It had been directing him toward things since the 2nd day of classes, not aggressively, not urgently, just the ambient pressure of a sensitivity that was now fully awake and noticing everything. The wrongness of Quirrell, present and consistent every time Harry was within 50 feet of the man. The compulsion architecture buried in the castle wards in one specific configuration that he hadn't been able to locate precisely yet. And this, a concentration of very old magic, dense and deliberate, behind a wall that should not have been as solid as it felt. He went on Friday evening, after dinner, when the library was occupied by older students who had homework and paid no attention to a first-year navigating the stacks. The shelf swung inward when he pressed the second post from the top, which he found by running his fingertips along the wood and feeling the different quality of the magic, older, keyed to something, in that specific spot. Behind it, 4 stone steps led down to a door. The door was a problem for exactly 30 seconds, which was how long it took Harry to understand that it wasn't locked against people, it was locked against intentions. Aggressive approach, it would resist. Straightforward ownership, it would respond to. He thought of it the way he thought of transfiguration, not open but yours. And the Peverell ring pulsed once, warm against his hand, and the door swung open. Inside was a room roughly the size of a large bedroom, which had no business existing in the geography of the library as Harry understood it. 3 walls were shelves. The 4th was a fireplace, currently dark. A reading table occupied the center with a single chair. The books on the shelves were, wrong wasn't the word. Concentrated was closer. Not evil, not dark in the theatrical sense. Dense. Books that held things that required space, that couldn't be left in open stacks because the casual brush of an unready mind against their content would be damaging in the way that touching a high-voltage wire is damaging, not because the wire means harm but because the contact is simply too much. Harry stood in the entrance for a moment and looked at them. Then he sat down at the table, pulled the closest book, and started reading. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he was carrying mental notes that would have filled 3 feet of parchment, on topics including the actual mechanics of the Deathly Hallows and their relationship to the Peverell bloodline, the history of family magic and how Lordship rings operated as conduits for ancestral power, a 7th century account of a Peverell lord who had stood at the boundary of the Vale and described what he'd seen in terms that matched Harry's dreams almost exactly, and, most relevantly, a short, dense chapter on magical compulsions, how they were constructed, how they were identified, and how they were removed. He read the compulsion chapter twice. Made sure he understood it completely. Then he spent 20 minutes sitting at the table doing nothing except feeling the castle's magical architecture, following the thread of the thing he'd been noticing since the second day with the focused attention the chapter had given him, and when he finally found it, located it precisely in the structure of his own magical signature, he sat with his hands flat on the table and thought, not for the first time and not with any particular drama, that Dumbledore was an extraordinarily skilled wizard. The compulsion was elegant. It wasn't crude push-you-this-way instruction. It was more like a thumb on the scales. Subtle depression of certain responses. Mild dampening of self-advocacy. A gentle, consistent pressure in the direction of compliance and trust in authority that had been sitting in Harry's magical architecture since, he couldn't be certain, but the depth of it suggested years. Early years. Since Privet Drive. Possibly since the night he was delivered there. Harry sat very still for a moment. Not angry. He was becoming genuinely interested in the fact that his primary response to things that should make him furious was instead this cold, clarifying calm, and he thought that was either a character trait or the Peverell gifts doing something to his emotional processing, and he intended to work out which, but not right now. Right now he followed the chapter's instructions, which were exacting and required precision he'd have been nervous about attempting 3 weeks ago but felt now, with the vault's density behind him and the rings warm on his hands, entirely confident about. He found the compulsion's anchor point in his own magic the way you find a splinter, by feel, by the specific quality of the resistance, by following the discomfort backward to its source. Then he, not tore it out, that would have been destructive. Dissolved it. The way you dissolve something that doesn't belong in water by changing the water's composition rather than reaching in. The difference, afterward, was not dramatic. It was more that the world felt about 3% more real. Like a filter he hadn't known existed had been lifted. The things he'd already decided and felt and thought were still there, unchanged, because they were genuinely his, but they felt more his now, more fully inhabited, the way a room feels more yours once you've cleared out someone else's furniture. He walked back to the dormitory in the dark and felt, with the Peverell awareness that was becoming as natural as sight, Quirrell 2 floors below him, and the wrongness emanating from the man like heat from a radiator, present, constant, sourced. Not tonight. But soon. The first flying lesson happened on Thursday of the second week, and Harry arrived at the pitch with the calm of someone approaching a thing they already knew they'd be good at, which was different from arrogance in a way that mattered. It was a good day, cool and clear, the castle visible above the grounds, brooms arranged in a line with their own ambient impatience. Madame Hooch strutted out in her yellow eyes and her referee's whistle and explained the mounting procedure with the efficient irritability of a person who had watched children drop brooms on themselves for 30 years and had no patience left for unnecessary variation. Up, she said. Harry's broom was in his hand before the word finished. Not because he'd forced it, it just came, the way it presumably came for people who the magic wanted to help. Around him, varying degrees of success played out. Hermione's broom rolled sideways, which she looked at with the expression of a person updating her list of required practice areas. Neville's shot up and hit him in the face. Nice reflexes, Potter, Hooch said, noting the immediate catch with the professional neutrality of someone recording data. Draco Malfoy, across the line, had watched the broom come to Harry's hand with narrowed eyes. He'd had his own success, his broom came up cleanly, and Harry noticed he held it well, with the easy posture of someone raised around Quidditch, but there was a calculation happening behind those grey eyes. Then Neville, startled by something Draco said, kicked off from the ground too hard and shot upward. Harry was already moving when Neville lost his grip and fell. Not consciously, not with considered heroism, his body just responded to the Peverell awareness, which registered the trajectory as a problem and sent him into the air before his mind had finished the thought. He caught Neville 15 feet off the ground with a hand fisted in the back of his robes and held him there, suspended, while Neville made sounds that suggested he was not enjoying the experience. "You can breathe," Harry told him, 10 feet up, which was probably not the most comforting thing to say but was the most immediately relevant. "I am breathing," Neville said, in the strained voice of someone doing the minimum required amount of breathing to technically qualify. Harry brought them down in a clean, easy arc and set Neville back on solid ground, and there was a moment of collective held breath from the watching class and then a general exhalation that was not quite applause but had the same social function. Madame Hooch was looking at him. "That," she said carefully, "was either the finest natural flying I've seen in a decade, or the most dangerous improvisation I've seen since the Weasley twins were third years." "How do I find out which?" Harry asked. The corner of her mouth moved. "Come see me at the weekend." McGonagall appeared at the edge of the pitch not 10 minutes later, and she took Harry aside with the expression of someone who has been handed a very specific kind of problem and is deciding how best to respond to it. "You flew without instruction," she said. "It seemed necessary at the time," Harry said. "Mr. Longbottom is unhurt." "He is." McGonagall looked at him for a moment with that deep, assessing attention. "The rule against first years on house teams," she said carefully, "is generally held to be—" "I know the rule," Harry said. "And I'm not asking to be on the team." He paused. "But I'd like to try out properly. If there's a mechanism for exceptions." "There is," McGonagall said, and the way she said it made clear there was already a plan for this. "I'll speak to the captain." She made a small, controlled adjustment to her expression that on anyone else would have been a smile. "You'll be required to demonstrate consistent ability over multiple sessions before a position is confirmed." "Obviously," Harry said. She walked back toward the castle and Harry watched her go and thought that he genuinely liked her, and that she genuinely liked him, and that this was uncomplicated and good in a world where most things were neither. He told Hermione and Neville about the compulsion that evening. Not the vault, not yet, the vault felt like something he wanted to sit with longer before sharing it, but the compulsion, because it was relevant and because they were his people and he wasn't going to keep things from his people. They were in the common room, the three of them in the corner by the window where they'd established an unofficial territory based on proximity to both the fire and the bookshelves. The room was busy enough that a quiet conversation disappeared into the ambient noise. He laid it out plainly. What the compulsion was, how it worked, how long it had likely been there, and whose magical signature, distinct and identifiable to anyone with the training to read it, was on the anchor point. Hermione's response was first. "He had no right," she said. It was very quiet and very absolute. Not performed outrage, genuine, cold anger, the kind that comes from a very principled person having a principle directly violated. "No," Harry agreed. "What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing yet," Harry said. "I'm going to let it be part of a larger conversation when the time is right." Hermione processed this. "You're collecting evidence," she said. "I'm building a picture," Harry said. "Dumbledore isn't a simple problem. He's been doing this, managing people, managing situations, managing outcomes, for decades. He genuinely believes it's necessary. That makes him more dangerous than someone doing it out of malice, because he'll have rationalized everything and he'll resist correction harder. He put a mind control charm on you when you were a baby," Neville said. He was very still, his hands flat on his knees, and there was something in his face that Harry recognized, that specific settling down of a person who has found the thing they're angry about and decided what to do with the anger. "To make you compliant. To make me easier to manage," Harry said. "Yes. Your parents were dead," Neville said. "And he, Neville." Neville stopped. "I know," Harry said. "I'm angry too. But we're 11. The anger is valid, but acting on it right now, confronting him directly, would accomplish nothing except alerting him that I know and giving him the opportunity to shore up his position before I have the legal standing to challenge it. He looked at Neville steadily. When I do this, I want to do it properly. I want there to be no recovery from it. Neville held his gaze. Then that quiet thing happened in his face again, the same shift Harry had seen on the train, that tectonic realignment. Okay, he said. I can wait. You're both being very calm about this, Hermione observed, in a tone that suggested she was also trying to be very calm about this and finding it slightly difficult. Would you prefer dramatic? Harry asked. I'd prefer effective, she said. Which is what you're describing. She pulled her charms textbook toward her with the decisive motion of someone redirecting energy. I'm going to research the legal classification of mind-affecting compulsions. If Dumbledore's signature is identifiable, we need to understand what statute that falls under. Page 47 of Wizarding Common Law and Noble Rights, Harry said. Third paragraph. Section 12b, specifically addresses mind-affecting modifications to magical minors by non-guardian parties. Of course you've already read it, Hermione said, but she was smiling. What does it say? It's a serious violation, Harry said. Carries the same weight as physical assault under magical law. The problem is evidence, you need to demonstrate the compulsion was placed deliberately, not accidentally. Which requires the anchor point signature. Which you say is identifiable. Unambiguously. Then we need a solicitor, Hermione said. A wizarding one. Someone with Wisengamot standing. I know someone, Harry said, because Griphook had, in his second weekly update, included the name and details of the goblin-aligned magical law firm that handled noble house interests, and had done so in the pointed way that suggested the information was offered rather than incidental. I'll write to Gringotts this week. Hermione nodded and opened her textbook, and for a few minutes the three of them sat in companionable, working quiet. Then Neville said, carefully, the professor. With the turban. What is that? Harry looked at the fire. Something I'm not ready to say out loud yet, he said honestly. Give me a bit more time. You already know what it is, Hermione said. Not an accusation, an observation. I have a hypothesis, Harry said. I want to confirm it before I say it, because once I say it the problem has to be dealt with, and I'd rather deal with it when I've chosen the timing rather than being pushed into it. That's, Hermione started, then stopped. That's actually a strategically sound position. Thank you. I still want to know. I know you do. She made a small, frustrated sound and went back to her book. He confirmed the hypothesis on Saturday morning. He engineered it himself, left the dormitory early, came down a route that took him past the third-floor corridor, and was rounding the corner near the staircase when Quirrell appeared at the far end of the hall, and the wrongness in the man's magical signature resolved itself at close range into something unmistakable. Two magical signatures, occupying one body. One was Quirrell's, frightened, fragmented, worn thin in the way of someone under sustained and considerable pressure. The other was something Harry had never encountered before but recognized anyway, the way you recognize the smell of smoke before you've seen a fire, ancient, dark, and furious in the specifically furious way of things that have been diminished and cannot forgive the diminishment. Voldemort. Not the Voldemort of fear and rumor, the name people wouldn't say. The actual thing, what remained of a man who had taken his own soul apart in the pursuit of power and was now, incomplete and desperate, hitching a ride in the back of someone else's head. Harry looked at Quirrell across the corridor and Quirrell looked back, and what happened in Quirrell's face was the most honest thing about him, pure, unmediated terror, because the thing living in the back of his head had seen the Peverell rings and was communicating its response directly to the man's nervous system, and the response was not composed. Harry held the moment for 3 full seconds, looking at Quirrell with the same steady, unhurried attention he gave everything, letting the man, and the thing behind his eyes, understand that he was seen, fully and precisely, and that Harry was not afraid. Then he nodded pleasantly, said, "Morning, Professor," and walked past. He heard Quirrell's breath behind him, ragged, short, the breath of a man gripping something very hard, and kept walking, and didn't look back. In the stairwell, alone, he stopped and stood for a moment. Voldemort is in the school, he thought, very clearly, the way you state a fact you need to hold firmly so you don't lose its shape. He's here, he's not fully present, he's occupying Quirrell, and he's afraid of the Peverell inheritance. Then, below that thought, the question that mattered, what does he want at Hogwarts? The answer came almost immediately, because Harry had been reading about it, the Philosopher's Stone, which he'd seen a reference to in the deeper accounts of Gringotts holdings, moved recently under high security. Moved to Hogwarts, specifically, which was an interesting choice if you were trying to keep it from someone who was already in the school. He thought of the third-floor corridor, the one Dumbledore had explicitly told the school was forbidden. The misdirection of that, the idea that the best protection for something was loud prohibition, was clever but relied entirely on the prohibitor being more knowledgeable than the person being prohibited. Harry went back to the dormitory, got his notebook, and started writing. He worked through the problem the way he worked through all problems, not from the emotional center of it, not from the urgency, but from the outside in. What was known? What was inferable? What needed verification? He had perhaps 5 months before whatever was going to happen around the stone came to a head, and he intended to use those 5 months well. He was 11 years old. He was carrying the magical inheritance of the oldest line in Britain and a burgeoning awareness of the deep structures of the world that was getting sharper every week. And the fragment of a shattered dark wizard, crammed into the back of a frightened man's head, was afraid of him. Harry looked at what he'd written and thought that the fear was reasonable. Then he folded the notebook, went down to breakfast, and told Neville he'd been right about the charm's homework being worth reviewing before Monday, and ate 3 pieces of toast, and didn't mention any of the rest of it, because the morning was clear and the castle was alive around him and some things deserved to remain simple and good while they still could. Chapter 4, House of Black. The letter to Gringotts went out on a Sunday, carried by Hedwig with the particular purposeful efficiency of an owl who treated every delivery as a personal responsibility. Harry watched her disappear over the tree-line from the Ollery window and then stood for a moment in the cold morning air, looking out at the grounds. October had arrived with the blunt force of Scottish autumn, the trees along the lake had gone copper and gold overnight, it seemed, and the wind off the water had an edge to it that made the morning runs Harry had taken to doing along the shore genuinely bracing. He'd started the runs in the 3rd week of term, partly because the physical discipline felt right, partly because moving through the castle's grounds in the early morning was the best way he'd found to map the full extent of what Hogwarts was, the way the wards shifted at different boundary points, the places where the old magic was densest, the exact geography of a place that was, he was increasingly certain, more alive than anyone officially acknowledged. The Ollery smelled of feathers and old straw and something sharply mineral that he'd come to associate with the owls themselves. He turned away from the window and started back down the spiral stairs, thinking about the letter's contents. He'd kept it direct. He needed the firm, Blackthorne and Associates, Magical Law, Diagon Alley, to file 3 things. First, a formal petition to the Wisengamot demanding a hearing on the illegal incarceration of Sirius Orion Black, former Lord Black, without trial. Second, a request for veritaserum examination of relevant parties, which was a blunt instrument but a legally sound one when you were dealing with an unjust conviction. Third, and this was the one that had taken him longest to word precisely, a formal complaint under Section 12(b) of Wizarding Common Law regarding the placement of a mind-affecting compulsion on a magical minor by a non-guardian party, with evidence to be submitted upon request. He hadn't named Dumbledore explicitly. He didn't need to. The filing itself would be enough to announce intent, and Dumbledore was perceptive enough to understand exactly what was moving toward him and from which direction. Harry had thought carefully about whether he was ready for that. Whether he had enough standing, enough legal support, enough of the picture assembled. He'd decided yes. Not because he was certain of winning immediately, he understood that institutions like the Wisengamot moved slowly and defensively and in their own self-interest, but because the filing created a public record. Once it existed, it couldn't be quietly made not to exist. Dumbledore could not address a complaint he hadn't been told was coming. That was the point. The response from Blackthorn arrived on Wednesday. Tertius Blackthorn was apparently 73 years old, which his letter conveyed through the density of his legal knowledge and the efficient brutality of his prose. He had handled noble house interests for 40 years. He had, the letter noted with considerable self-possession, been expecting a communication from the Potter Peverell estate since the Gringotts filing in August and was pleased to take the case. His rates were not discussed in the letter because, the postscript noted, his rates for the restoration of noble house rights were substantially reduced when the case was, as he put it, historically interesting. The current case was historically interesting. He had already filed the Sirius Black petition. It had been acknowledged, which meant a response was legally required within 30 days. Harry read the letter twice, folded it, and felt the black ring warm against his hand, not conspicuously, not dramatically, just present. Like the family paying attention. He showed Hermione the letter that evening. She read it with the focused intensity she brought to all written material. The 30-day response window, she said. What happens if they don't respond? Automatic escalation to the full Wisengamot bench, Harry said. Blackthorn outlined it in the second paragraph. Non-response is treated as procedural admission of irregularity. So they're forced to either respond and deal with it, or not respond and make it worse. She looked up. That's neat. He's been doing this for 40 years. The Section 12b complaint, she started. He filed it without a named defendant. As a pending inquiry. Which means Dumbledore can't respond to something that hasn't named him yet. But he knows, Harry said. He's known since last week, I imagine, because a man who has managed the magical world for 60 years does not miss things moving in his direction. Hermione set the letter down and looked at Harry with that expression she had, the one that was doing three things at once, cataloging and questioning and feeling, the emotional content she sometimes tried to keep separate from the analytical but which leaked through anyway. Are you worried about the fallout, she said. Not the legal part. Him. Harry considered that honestly. He's going to adjust, he said. He'll recalibrate how he's handling me. There might be a conversation, probably one where he's very reasonable and very warm and explains his perspective in terms that are designed to feel like being let into a confidence. He paused. I'm looking forward to it, actually. Hermione raised an eyebrow. I want to see how he does it, Harry said. He's the best at this I've ever encountered. It would be a waste not to learn from it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a very strange person, she said, but she was smiling. Noted, Harry said. The Quidditch tryout happened on a Thursday afternoon, and McGonagall told Oliver Wood about it with the expression of someone delivering a gift they were confident about. Wood, who was 15 and built like someone had designed him specifically for the purpose of captaining a Quidditch team, looked at Harry the way Harry imagined all Quidditch captains looked at unexpected talent, with a covetous, evaluating light in his eyes that had nothing personal about it. First year, Wood said, not as an objection exactly but as a fact he was arranging in his head. Yes, Harry said. Can you actually fly or was that, one way to find out, Harry said. Wood loaned him a Nimbus 2000, which was the best broom the team had, and Harry took it up without ceremony and spent 20 minutes demonstrating that the flying lesson hadn't been luck. He was a natural in the way that the word natural is technically accurate but insufficient. It wasn't that flying was easy for him, it was that he and the broom reached an immediate and mutual agreement about what they were doing. He moved like someone thinking about the air rather than through it. Would put him through drills that he'd clearly designed for older, more experienced players, watching from his own broom with that covetous evaluating look getting more pronounced, and called Harry down finally with the expression of a man who has been given something he's not sure how to justify to himself. Seeker, Wood said, on the ground. You'd be Gryffindor's youngest Seeker in a century. That's fine, Harry said. I need to tell you, Wood stopped. Started over. Slytherin's team is all on Nimbus 2001s. Their captain is third-year Marcus Flint and he searched for the professional term. A vicious, cheating, would, Harry said. And the Slytherin team fights dirty, is what I'm saying, and you're 11, and I just completed your advanced drills without dropping the broom once, Harry said. I appreciate the concern. Put me on the team. Wood looked at him for a moment. Then he grinned, sharp and bright, the grin of a captain who has just filled his last gap. Welcome to Gryffindor, he said. The first Slytherin encounter that mattered happened in the corridor outside the library on a Friday evening. Harry had been heading back from the vault. He visited twice a week now, methodically working through the shelves with Hermione's help since he'd finally shown her the hidden entrance in the third week of October, and she'd taken about 4 seconds to adjust to the existence of a hidden archive before beginning to catalog its contents with the focused thoroughness of someone giving themselves a project they actually deserve. She had found, in the vault, 2 texts on magical law that Blackthorn had not been aware existed. She'd sent copies to his office. His responding letter had expressed, through the controlled prose of a professional, something that might have been delight. Harry was alone tonight. Hermione had stayed back with a book on goblin metallurgy that she described as potentially relevant to several unresolved questions in the tone of someone having a very good time, and he rounded a corner near the library's main entrance and found Draco Malfoy standing in the corridor. Not with the 2 large boys this time. Alone, which was interesting. He was looking at something on the notice board, the Quidditch schedule, Harry noticed, which now listed Gryffindor's revised team including H. Potter as seeker. Draco had been looking at it with an expression that had some complexity in it, and when he registered Harry he didn't perform the usual casual contempt of their previous exchanges. He just looked at him. Potter, he said. Malfoy, Harry said, and stopped, because something in Draco's posture was different, the chin still elevated, but the aggressive architecture of it reduced slightly, like a house with its shutters open instead of closed. Seeker, Draco said, nodding at the notice board. Yes. You're a first year. You've mentioned that before. As though it's relevant. Draco's jaw shifted slightly. My father played Quidditch at Hogwarts, he said. He was very good, apparently. A pause. He also bought the entire Slytherin team new brooms this year. He said it flatly, without the usual pride performance. Just stated it. I know, Harry said. It was in the profit. Did you notice, Draco said carefully, that he bought the team new brooms at the same time Crabbe's father donated to the Hogwarts Building Fund and Goyle's father made a gift to St. Mungo's. Harry looked at him. I noticed, he said. Good, Draco said, and then seemed to run out of whatever had brought him to this edge of the conversation and took a step back. Not physically, socially. The shutters moving. Your seeker match is in November. Slytherin plays Hufflepuff first. He said it like he was offering information. Like it was a neutral thing. I know, Harry said. Thank you. Draco looked at him for a moment with an expression that was doing something genuinely complicated, warring things, the training of a lifetime pulling against the instinct of a boy who was, fundamentally, quite intelligent and therefore capable of recognizing when the framework he'd been given was cracking. The things you said on the train, Draco said. About the Peverells and blood status. Yes. I asked my father about the Peverell line when I got home for the weekend. What did he say? That the Peverells were the most ancient magical family in Britain and that their bloodline was entirely pure going back to the beginning of wizarding history. A beat. And that your mother was Muggle-born and therefore the bloodline had been irrevocably contaminated and you were barely worth acknowledging. Harry was quiet for a moment. What did you think about that answer? Draco's mouth pressed together. I thought it was, he stopped. Started again. Logically inconsistent, he said finally, and the phrase clearly cost him something, not embarrassment but the specific difficulty of saying out loud a thing you've only just admitted to yourself. If the Peverells are the most ancient and powerful family in British magical history, and the Peverell magic accepted you, and you're wearing those rings, then either blood purity works the way my father says and the magic should have rejected you, or it doesn't work exactly the way he says and the magic knows something he doesn't. The magic accepted my mother too, Harry said. She was the Peverell heir before me. Muggle-born. He let that sit. The magic is considerably older than the theory of blood purity. It has its own opinions. Draco said nothing for a long moment. His face was working. Genuinely working, in the way that faces work when the work is real and not performed. My father, he said finally, very quietly, has very strong opinions about how the world should be. He's been certain about them my entire life. He looked at Harry with something bleak in it. It's strange, when something suggests he might be wrong. Not nice strange. Just, he searched for the word. Unsteady, he said. Harry looked at Draco Malfoy, 11 years old, blonde, raised in a house where certainty was mistaken for wisdom, and felt something that wasn't pity but was adjacent to it. Not soft. Just real. I'm not your enemy, Malfoy, Harry said. I never have been, and I won't start. But I'm not going to pretend the world works the way your father says it does. I don't think you actually want me to. Draco looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor without another word, hands in his robe pockets, and the set of his shoulders was different from usual, less armored. Harry watched him go and thought that was either the beginning of something useful or the beginning of something painful, and that the difference would depend entirely on what Draco did with the unsteady feeling. The Wisengamot's response to Blackthorn's petition arrived on November the 5th, 3 weeks after filing. Harry got the news via Hedwig, who arrived at breakfast and deposited the letter in his porridge with the accuracy of an owl who was fully aware of the letter's significance and found the occasion appropriate for a small act of drama. He read it while Hermione watched him from across the table with the particular tension of someone waiting for test results. They've acknowledged the petition, he said. Hermione's breath came out. A hearing? A preliminary hearing. January. He looked at the letter's final paragraph. They've also, this is interesting. They've issued a formal request to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for documentation of the arrest and any associated trial proceedings for Sirius Black. He looked up. Which will either produce the trial documentation, confirming proper process, or reveal that no such documentation exists. Because there wasn't a trial, Hermione said. Because there wasn't a trial, Harry confirmed. Ron, who had been eating toast and listening with the expression of someone following a complicated sports match, said, they're going to find out he wasn't given a trial and they're going to have to deal with it. Correct, Harry said. They're going to hate that, Ron said, with the cheerful certainty of someone whose family's dinner table conversations had given him an intimate understanding of institutional discomfort. Tremendously, Harry agreed. He folded the letter. Across the great hall, at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was not looking at him. He was eating breakfast with his usual studied composure. But Harry noticed, in the ambient way he noticed most things, that the prophet on the table in front of Draco was open to the page with the brief ministry column about the Noble House petition. The piece was 3 paragraphs and carried the careful neutrality of journalism that doesn't know yet whether the subject is going to matter, and Draco's eyes were on it with an attention that his breakfast was not getting. Harry looked away. At the head table, Dumbledore was eating a bowl of porridge with absolute serenity, and his eyes, briefly, met Harry's, and Harry smiled and Dumbledore smiled back, and there was, between the two smiles, a quality of communication that had nothing to do with warmth. The Quidditch match against Slytherin was the 12th of November. The morning of it was cold and grey with a low sky that threatened rain but hadn't committed. Harry ate breakfast and read and ignored the nervous energy around him, what had been in a state of controlled emergency since Monday, running drills and tactical briefings and at one point delivering a speech that was so earnest it had made Fred Weasley press his fist to his mouth. "You nervous?" Neville asked at breakfast. "No," Harry said honestly. "At all?" "A little before I get on the broom," Harry said. "Then it goes away." "Must be nice," Neville said, looking at his own hands. Then, and this was the thing about Neville that Harry had been watching develop over the past 2 months, that slow, quiet building of something under the uncertainty, he straightened. I'm going to try the Wingardium Leviosa sequence the right way today. In charms. I've been doing the wrist movement wrong and the arc is too wide, Harry said. About 15 degrees. Bring it tighter. Is that, Neville blinked. You've been watching my wrist movement. I notice things, Harry said simply. The spell isn't the problem. The wrist is. Neville looked at his porridge for a moment and then looked up with a resolute expression that sat a lot better on his face than the habitual uncertainty did. Right, he said. The Quidditch pitch filled up by 10. The Slytherin section was loud and visually uniform, green and silver, which Harry had to admit was a good color combination, and the Gryffindor stand was louder if less coordinated, all red and gold and various degrees of scarf. Harry could hear the Weasley twins from the changing room. Madame Hooch ran the briefing with the crisply contained authority she brought to everything on a broomstick. Flint on the Slytherin side looked like someone had put a rugby player in Quidditch robes, big, aggressive, already communicating intent through the specific laziness of his posture that said I am going to hit you and I'm not worried about the consequences. He looked at Harry the way people looked at young players they intended to pressure and found Harry already looking back at him with complete tranquility. Flint's jaw tightened slightly. The whistle went, and the world simplified. This was the thing about flying that Harry had no words for yet, the way it stripped everything unnecessary and left only the immediate, the current, the real. The air was sharp and the sky was wide and below him the game unfolded with its own logic, the bludgers moving in trajectories that his Peverell awareness helped him track the way you track objects in peripheral vision, always present, always accounted for. The Slytherin Seeker, 4th year, lean and fast, on the best of the new Nimbus 2001s, started tracking Harry almost immediately rather than looking for the snitch himself, which was the defensive strategy Flint had apparently decided on. Keep the opposing Seeker occupied. Let the chasers build a lead. Harry understood the strategy. He thought it was wrong for one specific reason, it required him to respond to it. He didn't. He went high, above the chaser's operational altitude, and let the Slytherin Seeker follow him up, and then did something that was technically neither seeking nor seeker baiting but was more like choreography. He moved in ways that were interesting to follow but led nowhere, while simultaneously keeping half his attention, that ambient always present awareness, on the space below and around the pitch. The snitch was small and gold and had its own logic, moving in the gap between intention and accident, and Harry found it 32 minutes into the match, tucked against the far goalpost in the moment of stillness between two bludger trajectories, visible for about 4 seconds before it moved again. He dropped. Not dramatically, no diving arc, no showmanship. He just stopped being where he was and started being somewhere else, and the Slytherin Seeker, who had been shadowing him dutifully, had about 2 seconds to register what was happening before Harry had leveled out, hand extended, fingers closing. The snitch hit his palm like a heartbeat. The whistle went. The Gryffindor stand erupted. Harry circled back around the pitch and held the snitch up, and heard the roar of it, and let himself feel the simple animal satisfaction of having done something well in front of people who were glad of it. In the stands, Hermione was standing on the bench, and Neville was next to her looking like he might actually levitate from excitement, and Ron was making a sound that was technically a cheer but had transcended that category through volume alone. Landing, Wood grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him once, with the enthusiasm of a person who has been waiting his whole career for a seeker who didn't need managing, and said something that was probably coherent but got lost in the general noise. Harry grinned, a real one, the kind that felt strange on his face still because he hadn't had much practice with it until recently, and thought that this was good. This specific, simple thing. This was good. The Hogwarts winter was settling properly now, frost on the grounds in the mornings and the lake steaming slightly in the cold, and the castle's fireplaces going all day. Harry was walking back from the Ollery on a Sunday in late November when he felt the shift. Not in the castle. In himself. Specifically in the Black Ring, which had been doing something for the past week that he'd been trying to properly characterize, a kind of low, persistent resonance, not alarming but insistent. He'd noted it and waited for it to clarify, and now, standing in the cold outside the Ollery, it clarified. He felt serious. Not clearly. Not in detail. More like the sense of a direction, the way you can feel the sun on a cloudy day even without seeing it, a warmth from a specific point in the world. The family magic of the Blacks, which Harry now carried as its head, maintained a thread between the Lord and the named heirs and significant family members, and Sirius Black was still in Azkaban, and what came through the thread was, muted, damaged, but present. Alive. And aware, somewhere under the damage, that something had changed. Harry stood in the cold and spent a few minutes simply, sending something back down the thread. Not a message, nothing structured enough for that. Just presence. Acknowledgement. I know you're there. I'm coming. He didn't know if it reached. He thought it probably did. He went inside and wrote another letter to Blackthorn, asking about the possibility of a supervised visit to Azkaban by the Lord Black for welfare verification of a noble house member. The letter took 20 minutes because he had to find the exact legal phrasing that made the request inarguable, the phrasing Blackthorn had suggested in his first communication for exactly these kinds of encounters with bureaucracies that preferred not to be helpful. Hedwig took it without being asked, as though she'd been waiting. The response came in 4 days. A supervised visit, as Lord Black, was legally permissible. The ministry was not, however, enthusiastic. They would need to schedule it, which meant delays. The earliest available date was mid-January, which was also when the preliminary Wisingamot hearing was scheduled, and Harry read that coincidence and thought, with the cold, clarifying instinct the Peverell gifts kept sharpening, that it was not a coincidence. Someone in the ministry was managing the timing. Either to prevent him from seeing Sirius before the hearing, or to ensure both happened close enough together that the ministry could contain both within a single controlled response window. He wrote back to Blackthorn. Request the visit be separated from the hearing by at minimum 3 weeks, specifically to prevent any appearance that the two matters are being managed together by the ministry rather than addressed on their individual merits. If they refuse to separate them, note that this in itself constitutes evidence of institutional coordination regarding a wrongfully imprisoned man, and include that observation in the formal hearing record. He read it back. Added one more line. Also, can we accelerate the hearing? Is there a mechanism for expedited review when the subject is a noble house peer? Blackthorn's response to that final question came back in 2 days and was, for the first time, a letter that had something clearly delighted in it beneath the professional prose. There was indeed a mechanism. Invoked historically 3 times in the last 2 centuries. It required the lord of a noble house to appear before the chief warlock and make a direct appeal for expedited review of proceedings affecting a family member. The mechanism bypassed the scheduling process entirely. It required one thing, the lord appearing in person. Harry was 11 years old and a student at Hogwarts and had a charms test on Friday. He also, as it turned out, had a meeting with Dumbledore on Saturday. Dumbledore had requested the meeting through McGonagall on Tuesday, framed as an informal chat, the headmaster checking in on a new student. It was, Harry knew, the meeting he'd been expecting since he filed the first petition. He dressed for it deliberately, the dark green robes from Madame Malkin's, the rings visible, the quiet confidence of someone who has been managing the approach of this conversation for months. The headmaster's office was extraordinary and deliberately so, the portraits of old headmasters, the silver instruments on their spindles, the general architecture of accumulated wisdom and authority arranged to communicate both comfort and significance. Fawkes sat on his perch and looked at Harry with amber eyes that were very old and very kind, and Harry looked back and felt the Peverell awareness respond to the phoenix with something warm and uncomplicated, 2 things that were both ancient recognizing each other. Harry, Dumbledore said, rising from behind his desk, and the warmth in his voice was genuine, that was the thing Harry had to keep holding on to, the thing that made this complicated. It was genuine. It was real and warm and it coexisted with the man's certainty about what Harry should be, and those 2 things were not contradictions to Dumbledore, which was precisely what made him so difficult. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. They sat. Tea appeared. Harry watched Dumbledore pour it with that deliberate, unhurried grace and thought, here it is. Let's see how you do this. I understand you've been busy, Dumbledore said, with a warmth that suggested he found this admirable. The Gringotts matters, the legal filings. Quite remarkable for a young man of 11. I had good information, Harry said. My mother's letter was thorough. Something moved through Dumbledore's expression at the mention of Lily, real grief, real and honest, which Harry received without letting it move him from his position. She was extraordinary, Dumbledore said. You have her precision. And her opinion about your habit of making decisions for people without consulting them, Harry said, pleasantly, and held the older man's gaze. A silence. Not uncomfortable, too controlled for that. Dumbledore let it sit for a moment and then smiled, and the smile was acknowledgement, Harry realized. He was choosing to receive the observation rather than deflect it. Your mother disagreed with some of my methods, he said. She told me so. I know. She told me in the letter. Harry picked up his tea. I want to understand something, Professor. Not challenge you. Understand. Do you believe the compulsion you placed on me was necessary? Dumbledore looked at him steadily. I wondered when we'd arrive at that. You've known about the filing since it was submitted. Yes. Then I'll ask again. Did you believe it was necessary? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment in the way of a person choosing the exact right words, not to deceive but to be completely precise. I believed, he said finally, that a child carrying the magical weight you carry, placed in the circumstances you were placed in, required modulation of certain responses. To ensure you survived your early years without drawing attention that would have been dangerous. You didn't ask my parents, Harry said. The compulsion predates their deaths. I checked the depth of it. A pause. Smaller than the first one. No, Dumbledore said. I did not. You made a decision about someone else's child without consulting them, Harry said. Based on your own judgment about what was necessary. Which turned out to include placing me with the Dursleys against explicit instructions in my father's will. The blood protection was important, Harry said. I know. I've read about it. It was also not the only option available, and you chose it anyway, and placed a compulsion to ensure I wouldn't resist it, and have been managing the situation since. He set down his tea. I'm not here to have a fight with you. I genuinely mean that. You are the most capable wizard I've ever encountered and this school is extraordinary and I believe you want good outcomes. He paused. I also need you to understand that I am lord of two noble houses, I carry the Peverell inheritance, and the days of being managed without my knowledge are finished. I need you to hear that as information, not as a challenge. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The amber instruments on their spindles made small sounds in the silence. Fawkes shifted on his perch. You are, Dumbledore said slowly, very much your mother. I'll take that, Harry said. The hearing, Dumbledore said. Serious. January, Harry said. Though I've asked Blackthorn about the expedited review mechanism. Something flickered in Dumbledore's eyes. Not alarm, surprise. Genuine, controlled surprise at the specific depth of research. You know about the direct appeal. I've done a lot of reading, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet for another moment. Then he leaned back in his chair with a subtle shift in his posture, not defeat, nothing as simple as that. More like a recalibration. Like a chess player who has been playing a game they thought they understood and has just noticed the board is configured differently than they thought. Sirius Black, Dumbledore said carefully, is complicated. His incarceration was, I had concerns at the time, about the speed of the process, and he stopped. For the first time in the conversation, he was not in full control of the words, and the lack of control was more honest than anything else he'd said. You had concerns and you said nothing, Harry said. I was managing a great many things. I know. Harry stood. I'm not asking you to apologize today, Professor. I'm asking you to stay out of the Wisengamot process. He held Dumbledore's gaze. Let the law do what the law should have done in 1981. Let Sirius have the hearing he deserved. Don't manage this one. Fawkes sang one note, clear and brief, and it hung in the office air for a moment like something confirmed. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter, 11 years old, 2 lordship rings, the particular quality of his mother's precision meeting his father's absolute refusal to be moved, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Small and considered and genuine. Very well, he said. Harry walked back down the spiral staircase and into the corridor and stood for a moment in the cold stone quiet of the castle. The black ring was warm against his hand. The Peverell ring was warm against the other. The machinery was moving now. It would go where it was going, and he had done what he could do to point it right, and for now that was enough. He had a charms test on Friday, and a letter to write to his godfather that he'd been composing in pieces for 6 weeks and needed to finish, and it was almost dinner time, and somewhere in the castle Hermione was probably still in the vault with the Goblin Metallurgy book, and Neville had told him at breakfast that he'd finally got the Wingardium Leviosa wrist movement right, and the charms professor had given him 8 out of 10. Harry went to dinner, and ate well, and let the pieces move. Chapter 5. The mirror and the man. December arrived and brought with it the specific quality of cold that only exists in Scottish castles, the kind that lives in the stones themselves, that no amount of fireplace warmth entirely displaces, that makes the corridors in the early morning feel like the inside of a held breath. Snow came on the 8th and stayed, and Hogwarts became the place Harry had half seen in the descriptions from his mother's letter, the place that existed in a different register from the ordinary world, all towers and white and the particular beauty of something ancient wearing weather well. He'd finished the letter to Sirius. It had taken 6 weeks and 14 drafts because every version he wrote felt either too much or not enough, too formal, or too nakedly wanting, or too focused on the legal situation when the legal situation was not actually what he needed to say. The final version was 2 pages and didn't mention the Wisengamot once. It told Sirius who Harry was. Not what he'd inherited or accomplished, who he was. The things he'd noticed about himself over 4 months of being properly awake, that he thought better when moving, that the early morning was his best thinking time, that he had found 3 people he would do serious things for, that he could feel the family magic through the ring and that sometimes in the early mornings he directed some of it toward Azkaban hoping it arrived as warmth. He didn't know if Sirius could receive letters in Azkaban. Griphook had told him there was a mechanism, prisoners of noble houses retained certain rights, and a Lord Black directing correspondence to a House Black member was one of them, legally inarguable. Hedwig had carried it out a week ago and had returned without the letter, which meant it had been delivered rather than refused, and Harry had no way of knowing whether Sirius had been coherent enough to read it or whether it was sitting in a cell somewhere providing nothing except the most abstract comfort of proximity. He told himself the proximity was something. He mostly believed it. The vault in December had a different quality. Hermione had observed at first, that the magic in the room seemed to deepen in winter, the old texts giving off more of their particular density, the fireplace lighting itself without being asked on the coldest evenings. She had a theory about it, something involving the relationship between seasonal magical flux and archival preservation, that she'd been developing in a small notebook she kept separate from her school notes. Harry had read 3 pages of it and found it genuinely interesting, which she had received with the expression of someone who had not expected to find their theoretical work appreciated at age 11 and was adjusting her expectations accordingly. Tonight they were both in the vault, the fireplace going, Hermione's notebook open beside a text on magical resonance and Harry working through the 7th century Peverell account he'd been returning to all term, the one about standing at the veil's edge, which kept yielding new details as his own understanding deepened. "There's a passage I don't understand," Hermione said, not looking up from her book. "Read it." She read. It was from a text on the theory of magical inheritance, a dense paragraph about the way lordship magic accumulated across generations and what it meant for the heir who finally activated a long-dormant line. The specific thing she didn't understand was a reference to the debt-calling function of ancestral bonds, which the text described as the most rarely invoked and most politically significant capacity of a noble house lord. It means I can call in favors, Harry said. Every significant positive interaction a house has had with another family over centuries, alliances, aid, assistance, generates a magical bond. It's not a financial debt, it's a magical one. The lord of the house can activate those bonds formally and request reciprocal obligation. Hermione looked up. How many does the House of Black have? Griphook's been compiling them, Harry said. It's a long list. And the Peverells? Even longer. He paused. And older. Which means more significant, because the older bonds carry more magical weight. He turned a page in the Peverell account. The Longbottoms have one with the Blacks going back 4 generations. The Bones family has one going back 6. The Pruitts, that's the Weasleys through Molly's maiden name, have 3 separate ones at different periods. Hermione was quiet for a moment, doing what she always did when information arrived, finding its edges, testing its weight. If you invoked those bonds, she said carefully, in the context of the Wisingamot hearing, you'd have a legal and magical claim on the support of most of the moderate families, Harry said. Yes. That changes the hearing. That changes everything about the hearing, Harry said. Which is why I'm not invoking them yet. If I walk into the Wisingamot with those bonds activated, it looks like a power play. I want the hearing to be about Sirius, not about me. He looked at the fire for a moment. The bonds are the contingency. If the hearing goes wrong, if the ministry tries to bury it, then I invoke them and they're suddenly looking at a room full of magical obligations they can't ignore. Hermione was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this since October. Since Gringotts, Harry said honestly. She picked up her notebook and wrote something. Then she looked at him across the table with that expression, the one that was doing several things at once, and said, I want to ask you something personal. Go ahead. Does it get heavy? She said. Carrying all of this. The planning and the legal work and the awareness. You're always tracking 10 things at once. You notice everything. Does it get heavy? Harry thought about it honestly, which she deserved. Sometimes, he said. Late at night. It's not the planning that's heavy, I'm aware that the outcomes matter for real people. Sirius. Neville's parents. It's not abstract. He paused. But it's not heavier than the alternative, which is being aware that things need doing and choosing not to do them. Hermione nodded slowly. I just want to make sure you know it's not all on you, she said. We're here. It was simply said, without fanfare, the way genuinely important things sometimes were. I know, Harry said. She went back to her book. Harry looked at the Peverell text and the fireplace and the old stones of the vault and felt the weight of it, exactly as described, exactly as real, and felt also the warmth of 2 people on either side of him who knew what he carried and had decided, entirely voluntarily, to stand in the same direction. He kept reading. He found the mirror on a Tuesday in the last week before Christmas. Most of the school had gone home for the holidays. The corridors had that particular resonance of emptied spaces, sounds traveling differently through a castle not packed with people. Harry had stayed, there was no question of going back to Privet Drive, and the leaky cauldron felt wrong now when he had a room in Gryffindor Tower, and so had Ron, whose family hadn't arranged to collect him, and Hermione, whose parents had asked and been told she'd rather stay, a conversation Harry suspected had been more complicated than she'd indicated. He was following something. He'd been aware of it for 3 days, a pull in the Peverell awareness, directional and distinct, not urgent but consistent. Not threatening. More like something very old in the castle recognizing something very old in him and trying to communicate the geographical relationship between them. He'd followed it down 2 floors and through 2 unused corridors and into a room he didn't have on his mental map of the castle, which given the depth of that map was itself significant. The mirror of Eriste stood against the far wall of the empty classroom with the quiet authority of something that had been here long enough to consider the room its own. It was tall, taller than the doorframe it clearly hadn't come through, and its frame was carved with an inscription that ran the full perimeter. Harry read the inscription easily, Erist stra eru oit ube kafru oit anwosi, and mentally reversed it without effort and absorbed the information it contained and then looked at the glass. The mirror showed him his parents. Not as he'd expected, not the photograph quality he knew from the single image he'd carried for years. They were alive in the mirror. His mother with her red hair loose and her eyes the exact green he saw in the mirror every morning, standing close beside a dark-haired man who was laughing at something just outside the frame. His father had his glasses and his easy posture and the specific quality of aliveness that only exists in people who are fully present in their own life. And they were looking at him. Not past him. At him. With the direct, specific recognition of parents who know their child and are glad to see him. Harry stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He didn't try to touch it. He didn't move closer. He just looked, and let himself feel the full weight of what he was looking at, not trying to be measured about it, not trying to be strategic about it, just a boy who had grown up with a single photograph and was now looking at his parents' faces with some semblance of life in them. His mother's face in the mirror moved. Not dramatically. She looked at him and her expression did something complicated, grief and love and something that was almost amusement, the expression of a person who has been told a story about someone they love and finds it perfectly, characteristically right. She pressed her hand against the glass from inside. Harry pressed his hand against the glass from outside. He didn't cry. He was honestly not sure why. He felt the shape of what would have been tears, felt the pressure of it behind his eyes and in his throat, but what came out wasn't grief exactly. It was something more like completion. Like a gap that had always been in the architecture of him being acknowledged. Not filled. Acknowledged. He stood there for 20 minutes. Then he straightened, and looked at his parents' faces one more time, and said, "I'm doing all right," out loud, because the mirror felt like a place where that kind of thing was appropriate and because he needed to say it to them specifically. His mother smiled. He turned away from the mirror and went back to the corridor and walked back toward Gryffindor Tower, and the cold in the stones was just cold, and the castle was just a castle, and he was just himself, and all of that was, he found, exactly enough. He went back to the mirror 2 nights later, and Dumbledore was there. Not hiding, the headmaster was standing to the side of the room with a quality of having been here for a while, and he looked at Harry's entrance with an expression that was careful and warm and slightly uncertain in a way Harry hadn't seen from him before. "I wondered if you'd come back," Dumbledore said. "I wondered if you'd be here," Harry said. They looked at each other for a moment across the empty classroom. The mirror stood between them, equidistant. "What do you see?" Dumbledore asked. "My parents," Harry said simply. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "It shows us the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts," he said. "Most people who find it cannot leave it. They sit before it and waste away." "I know," Harry said. "I read the inscription the first night." He looked at the mirror. "It's the most powerful emotional artifact I've ever encountered. But the desire it shows me isn't something I can have, not in the way the mirror presents it. My parents are dead. What the mirror shows me isn't them, it's what I want them to be." He paused. "I can acknowledge the wanting and still understand that sitting here trying to have something that's an image instead of a reality isn't something I'm willing to do. My mother's letter is more real to me than the mirror." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "Most people don't reason their way to that conclusion," he said. "Most people don't have Peverell clarity on what's real and what's an echo of it," Harry said. He looked at Dumbledore. "You moved something here recently," he said. "Into the castle. Something that needed protecting." A pause. "Did I?" "The mirror is new to this room," Harry said. "It was moved to this corridor specifically. There's an older location signature in the room's magical residue. The mirror was somewhere else in the castle for a long time and was moved within the last 4 months." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "And there's something inside it. Not a reflection. Something actual, stored in the mirror space." Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter with an expression that had moved past simple surprise into something that was genuinely, deeply at a loss, not for what to say, but for what to do with the fact that an 11-year-old had just correctly, precisely, and independently identified the location and function of the Philosopher's Stone. "You've known about the stone for some time," Dumbledore said. It wasn't a question. "Since September," Harry said. "I know what's living in Professor Quirrell. I know what it wants. I know the stone is what it's here for." He tilted his head slightly. "I've been waiting for it to make its move rather than acting prematurely, because I wanted to understand the full shape of the situation before I did anything about it." "Harry, he's going to come for it," Harry said. "Probably soon. The holidays are the obvious window: reduced staff, reduced students, reduced attention. He's been building toward this all term." He looked at the mirror. "The protection is elegant, by the way. Showing the stone to anyone who wants to use it but only giving it to someone who wants to find it without using it. Very Peverell-Logic, actually. I designed it with a particular understanding of desire in mind," Dumbledore said, and his voice was quiet and very careful. "I know," Harry said. "And it would work on almost everyone." He looked at Dumbledore. "The fragment of Voldemort in Quirrell can't use the mirror's protection because wanting is the only mode it has left. It can't want to find without using. That's what it is now, pure, diminished wanting." Dumbledore sat down slowly in a chair that had appeared, as chairs sometimes did in Hogwarts, at a needed moment. He looked at Harry with an expression stripped of most of its professional scaffolding, and what was underneath was a man who was very old and very tired and genuinely uncertain, for possibly the first time in decades, of how to proceed. "What will you do?" Dumbledore asked. "Be here when he comes," Harry said. "Let it happen on my terms rather than his. You're 11 years old." "You keep noting that," Harry said. "I understand why. But I'm also the Peverell heir, and what Quirrell is carrying is a fragment of a man who has been afraid of the Peverell inheritance since he first learned what it was. The power dynamic is not what it looks like on the surface." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. "I should be here," he said. "When it happens." "You should be somewhere Voldemort's fragment believes you're not," Harry said. "The plan only works if he thinks the path is clear. If he senses you nearby, he goes to ground and we lose the window." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "I need you to trust me." The word trust landed in the space between them with all the history of the past 4 months behind it. Dumbledore looked at him. "You are asking me," he said slowly, "to trust an 11-year-old student to handle a confrontation with a fragment of the most dangerous dark wizard of the century." "I'm asking you to trust the Peverell inheritance," Harry said, "which is rather older and more specifically relevant to this situation than the alternative." Fawkes was not present, but Harry felt the castle's attention in the way he sometimes did, that ambient living awareness in the stones, the magic that was Hogwarts itself, turning toward this room with something that felt like anticipation. Dumbledore looked at the mirror. At Harry. At the mirror again. "I'll be at the end of the corridor," he said finally. "No closer." "And at the first sign, I know," Harry said. "Thank you." It was 3 nights later. Harry felt the shift in the castle's awareness at 11:30, a disturbance in the wards that had the specific texture of someone passing through them under concealment. He was awake, had been awake, sitting in the common room with a book he wasn't reading, because the Peverell awareness had been building all day towards something with the quality of a weather change, that atmospheric pressure shift that says tonight. He dressed, put on his shoes, went to the mirror's room. He arrived before Quirrell. The classroom was empty and cold and the mirror stood silent against the wall. Harry crossed to it and looked at his reflection, just his reflection now, his parents not present because the thing he desired most at this moment was not them, it was something he was already doing. The mirror showed him standing in this room with both rings burning bright on his hands, and he thought, in a distant, academic way, that the mirror was showing him success, which was also the thing he wanted. It was good to know they were aligned. He stood facing the door and waited. Quirrell came through the door 6 minutes later, walking with the shuffling, possessed gait he'd had since September, and stopped when he saw Harry. "You," Quirrell said, and his voice was not quite his own, it had that doubled quality, something else in the register underneath, something that was using Quirrell's vocal cords like an instrument it didn't particularly respect. "Hello, Professor," Harry said. "Step aside," Quirrell said. "You shouldn't be here, boy." "I'm exactly where I should be," Harry said pleasantly. "But we should probably skip the part where you pretend you don't know what I am, because we've both known what the other is since September and I'd rather we had an honest conversation." A pause. Then Quirrell's hands came up and unwound the turban, and the wrongness that Harry had been feeling as ambient background noise all term suddenly resolved into full presence, and the face on the back of Quirrell's head opened its eyes. What looked at Harry was not Voldemort as myth or rumor. It was what was left of Tom Riddle, a fragment of a man who had torn his soul apart in the pursuit of permanence, reduced to parasitism and desperation, stretched thin across years of disembodiment. The face was barely a face. Pale and flat and burning with a terrible, diminished intelligence that had been a great mind once and was now that mind's worst quality extracted and concentrated, the hunger, the certainty of superiority, the absolute inability to accept limitation. Harry looked at it steadily. "Lord Peverell," Voldemort said, and his voice from the back of Quirrell's head was a whisper that had tremendous reach, the way certain sounds carry not through volume but through a quality of intention. "How unexpected." "Not particularly," Harry said. "I've known you were here since the second day of term. You've known what I am since then too. We've been having a very polite standoff." "Give me the stone," Voldemort said. "Step aside, and I won't." "Don't," Harry said. The word was not loud. It carried, in it, the quality of someone interrupting a speech they've heard before and find beneath their time. Voldemort's eyes, Quirrell's eyes with Voldemort burning behind them, narrowed. "You are 11 years old," he said. "You are a child. You're a fragment," Harry said. "You split your soul so many times there's barely enough of you left to want things coherently. That's why the mirror won't give you the stone, you can't want something without wanting to use it, and the mirror knows the difference." He tilted his head. "You know what the Peverell inheritance actually is, don't you? The real version, not the myth." A stillness from Voldemort that was almost imperceptible. A flicker of something that might have been, not fear, exactly. Recognition of a category of thing one has reason to be cautious about. "You've been hiding from death your whole life," Harry said. "Literally. Everything you've done, the Horcruxes, the rituals, all of it, has been about making yourself unkillable because you cannot accept that death is part of what magic is. You treat it as an enemy because you're afraid of it." He paused. "I carry the Peverell inheritance. I've been in conversation with what you've been running from since I was 11 years old. And what I can tell you, for free, right now, is that what you're afraid of is not what you think it is." "Sentiment," Voldemort whispered. "Accuracy," Harry said. He moved toward the mirror. Quirrell lunged forward, Voldemort driving him, and the curse that came was nonverbal and dark and fast, and Harry stepped aside from it with the reflexive awareness of someone who has been processing spatial information at an elevated level for 4 months. Not graceful, not performed, just faster than expected, the way things sometimes are when you understand the geometry. He touched the mirror's frame. The stone dropped into his hand. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a deep red, dense and warm, and the magic in it was extraordinary and tremendously concentrated, the kind of ancient, accumulated power that had sat in the same matrix for centuries and become nearly geological in its patience. He turned and faced Quirrell again. "Here is what happens now," Harry said, the stone in his hand, and his voice was exactly as calm as it had been before, because the situation had not changed, only clarified. "I'm not giving you the stone. Not because I'm particularly attached to it, but because the way you'd use it would make things worse for everyone, including you. A full resurrection built on a stolen stone while you're already fragmented, you'd be spending the rest of your existence being less than you were before you started. Give me the stone. Voldemort's voice cracked with concentrated will. No, Harry said. Quirrell came at him. What happened next happened in several seconds and Harry didn't plan it, not precisely. The Peverell awareness moved faster than conscious planning, the same way the broom moved faster than thought on the Quidditch pitch. He caught Quirrell's wrist, both hands, and held it. The burning was immediate and mutual. Quirrell screamed, a sound with two registers, the man and the thing inside the man, both in pain from the same source. Harry held on. The Peverell rings were incandescent now, both of them, the black stone and the gold flaring with a light that was not violent but was absolute, the light of something very old and very patient completing a function it had been designed for, which was this, exactly this, the specific contact between the Peverell inheritance and the thing that had tried to cheat death and made itself into its own worst fear. The burning was real. His hands hurt. He held on anyway. Let go, something said, not Voldemort, not any voice outside himself. The deep Peverell awareness, the thing that had been watching and waiting and showing him the road. You don't need to hold. Just, be what you are. Harry stopped gripping and opened his hands. The light stayed. The contact stayed. But the quality of it changed, it was no longer pressure but presence, the way a very powerful, very certain thing is present when it has no need to demonstrate itself. Quirrell folded. Not dramatically. Not with theatrical force. His knees went and he went down with the quiet collapse of a person whose borrowed strength has simply withdrawn, and Voldemort's face on the back of his head was screaming, not in sound, in something below sound, in the register of things that understand they have met their limit and cannot process the information. Then the fragment lifted. Harry felt it go, a smearing of dark intention upward and outward, dissipating at the edges, looking for purchase and finding nothing sufficient to anchor to. The castle's wards moved against it with the unhurried authority of several centuries of protective magic, and what had been Voldemort's fragment scattered into the cold and was gone. Quirrell lay on the floor, breathing. Barely, but breathing. Harry crouched beside him. Quirrell, he said. Can you hear me? A sound that might have been yes. He's gone, Harry said. You need a healer. I'm going to call for help. He stood, looked at the mirror, and set the stone on the frame's edge. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and called down the corridor without raising his voice. Professor Dumbledore. Dumbledore appeared at the corridor's end in approximately the time it takes a man who has been standing there waiting for permission to run. He arrived in the doorway, took in the room, Quirrell on the floor, Harry standing, the stone on the mirror's frame, and was quiet for a full 3 seconds. Quirrell needs a healer, Harry said. He's alive. Voldemort's fragment is gone. It dispersed, I don't know how permanent that is, so we'll want to be prepared for the possibility that it anchors somewhere else. He looked at Dumbledore. The stone should go back to Nicholas Flamel. Being here was always a temporary solution and keeping it at Hogwarts longer than necessary creates more risk than it resolves. Dumbledore crossed to Quirrell and crouched, checking him with a quick, expert hand. He looked up at Harry. Your hands, he said. Harry looked at his hands. They were red, mildly burned, already beginning to register the pain more fully now that the adrenaline of the encounter was settling. I'll go to the hospital wing, Harry said. In a moment. Dumbledore stood. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was, stripped, again. That quality of scaffolding removed, the man underneath visible. He was very old and he had been carrying the weight of the war and its aftermath for decades and he had, tonight, stood at the end of a corridor and trusted an 11-year-old to do something he couldn't have trusted anyone to do, and the trust had been exactly right, and he was looking at the result of that with something that was not quite awe but was genuinely, deeply close to it. You used no curse, Dumbledore said. No, Harry said. You held him with your hands. The Peverell contact was the mechanism. Not a curse. Curses would have been, he thought about how to say it. Wrong. Curses are about imposing. This was more about, being clear about what I was. And what are you? Dumbledore said, and the question was genuine, no rhetoric in it, no leading. Harry looked at the stone on the mirror's frame. At his burned hands. At the empty, dispersed space where Voldemort had been. I'm my mother's son, he said. I'm Lord of Two Houses. I'm 11 years old and I'm going to the hospital wing. He paused at the door. And I'd like you to be at the Wisengamot hearing in January, Professor. Not to manage it. Just to be there. He looked back. You've done a lot of things wrong. But you're not on the wrong side. I'd rather you were visible than absent. Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. I'll be there, he said quietly. Harry walked out into the corridor and down toward the hospital wing and let the pain in his hands be real, let the cold of the castle be real, let all of it be real because it was and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. The stone was safe. Quirrell was alive. The fragment was gone. It was not finished, he knew that, knew it with the deep awareness that never let him kid himself about incomplete things. Voldemort was not destroyed, only dispersed. He would find something else, anchor somewhere else, wait in the dark with the terrible patience of things that cannot die. The story did not end here. But this chapter of it did, and it had ended on Harry's terms, and that mattered. Madame Pomfrey looked at his hands with the professional alarm of someone who takes pride in an intact student population and demanded to know immediately what had happened. He told her. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that went through several stages before settling on the slightly disbelieving efficiency of a woman who had worked at Hogwarts for 30 years and still, occasionally, found something that surprised her. She healed his hands in 20 minutes with a salve that smelled of something sharp and sweet and a series of incantations that she performed with the automatic precision of deep expertise, and when she was done she put a screen around his bed and told him to sleep, and he did. He dreamed of the road, and the shapes moving along it, and the vast patient attention at the edges of the dream. He dreamed of his mother, not in the mirror, not a reflection, somewhere real, somewhere the road went, turning to look at him with that expression he was starting to recognize. The one that said she found him, as she had always found him, exactly right. He slept, and the castle settled around him into the deep silence of the very early morning, and the stone was in Dumbledore's keeping, and the fragment was scattered, and the war that was not finished had, for tonight, been held off its course. That was enough. That was, for right now, completely enough. Chapter 6, Lord of Two Houses. January came in cold and purposeful. Harry's hands healed completely within 3 days, which Madame Pomfrey attributed to the quality of her salve and Harry attributed to the Peverell inheritance's apparent opinion that he didn't have time for prolonged recovery. The burns left no marks. He was back in classes by Thursday and in the vault by Friday evening, and if the school had been buzzing with rumor about what had happened on the 3rd floor the night before Christmas break, Harry neither confirmed nor denied anything, because the official account from Dumbledore's office was that Professor Quirrell had suffered a severe magical episode and would not be returning, and Harry had no particular interest in replacing that account with a more dramatic version. He had enough drama incoming. The Wisengamot preliminary hearing was January the 14th. Blackthorne had sent a comprehensive briefing in the first week of January, 12 pages of dense, precise legal preparation, the kind of document that conveyed, between every line, that its author had spent 50 years waiting for a case this genuinely important and was not going to waste the opportunity. He had obtained, through the formal ministry documentation request, the arrest records for Sirius Black. There were no trial records. Because there had been no trial. The arrest record showed Sirius Orion Black detained November 1, 1981. Transferred to Azkaban November 3, 1981. Classification, mass murderer, Death Eater, accessory to the deaths of James and Lily Potter. Signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr., then head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. 2 days. Arrested, classified, imprisoned. No hearing, no Veritaserum examination, no representation, no Wisengamot proceeding of any kind. Harry had read the document 3 times when it arrived and then set it down on the library table and looked at the far wall for a moment. Not with anger, with the cold, specific fury that comes from seeing bureaucratic cruelty made concrete in official language, all its damage documented in the neutral prose of administrative process. 2 days, Hermione said, from across the table. She'd read it over his shoulder. Her voice had a quality he recognized, the tight, controlled sound of someone keeping their anger from outrunning their usefulness. 2 days, Harry confirmed. Crouch signed it, she said. Crouch was the architect of it, Harry said. He had emergency wartime powers and he used them, and then the war ended and Sirius was in Azkaban and the paperwork existed, so no one looked harder at whether the paperwork was adequate. He paused. It wasn't malice, probably. It was efficiency. Wartime thinking applied past the end of the war. That's almost worse, Neville said quietly. He was at the end of the table, working through his herbology essay but clearly following the conversation with full attention. That someone could just forget to check. And a man spent 12 years in Azkaban. 11 years, Harry said. He's been there since November 81. 12 years in February. He stood. I need to write to Blackthorn tonight. Already done, Hermione said, and slid a piece of parchment across the table. Harry picked it up. She'd drafted the letter, concise, pointed, identifying 3 specific legal arguments that the absent trial documentation supported. All 3 were arguments he would have made. She'd found one additional statute he hadn't known about, a 1798 provision that specifically addressed the rights of noble house members during wartime emergency periods, which strengthened the case considerably. He looked at her. You were going to write it tonight, she said. I had a head start. The 1798 statute took me most of yesterday to find. Where did you find it? Vault, she said. Shelf 3, second from the right, a collection of pre-ministry legal instruments nobody has read in about a century. Hermione. I know, she said, waving a hand. You're going to say something about how I didn't have to do this. I was going to say thank you, Harry said. She blinked. Then she looked at the table and said, right. Yes. You're welcome. A pause. Add a note at the end about the 1798 statute in your own words. Blackthorn will want to know how you found it, and it'll carry more weight coming from the lord of the house than from the person who actually found it, Harry said. From someone without legal standing in this matter, Hermione said precisely, and picked up her quill again. Neville, at the end of the table, smiled at his herbology essay. Dumbledore arranged for Harry's absence from classes on January the 14th without comment, a note to McGonagall that said only that Lord Black had Wisengamot business and that his absence should be recorded as approved leave. McGonagall delivered this information to Harry with an expression of someone who had made a private determination to have no feelings about any of this until later. The hearing is at 10, she said. Mr. Blackthorn will meet you at the ministry. Yes, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. Your transfiguration work this term has been exceptional, she said, in the tone of someone making a deliberate decision to say something concrete when the larger things were too large for the corridor. Thank you, Professor. The academic standard, she said, very precisely, is expected to be maintained regardless of external proceedings. Of course, Harry said. She made the small movement that, in McGonagall, constituted a nod of approval, and walked away, and Harry thought that she was telling him, in her way, that he was still a student, still her student, and that this was not a diminishment of the other things but a foundation beneath them. He appreciated it more than he'd have expected. The Ministry of Magic was exactly what the reading had suggested and somewhat more than the imagination had prepared for. The atrium had the specific quality of institutional power expressed through architecture, high ceilings, fountain at the center, fireplaces along the walls constantly cycling through arriving and departing witches and wizards, and the ambient hum of a bureaucracy that had been operating for 2 centuries under the fundamental premise that it was the most important thing happening in Britain. Harry walked through it in his dark green robes with the rings visible and Blackthorn at his side, and noted with the same ambient attention he applied to everything that several people stopped walking when they saw him. Not all of them knew who he was. Some of them were responding to the rings, the black and Peverell crests, readable to anyone with the training, which in the ministry meant most people in the building. He could see them doing the calculation: 2 lordship rings, first-year age, black hair, Lily Evans' eyes. Blackthorn was exactly what his letters had implied, a tall, angular man of 73 with the kind of posture that only comes from decades of standing in formal legal proceedings and winning most of them. He wore robes the color of mahogany and carried a briefcase that, Harry suspected, contained about 900 pages of legal precedent. He'd shaken Harry's hand at the floor connection point with the crisp efficiency of someone who had been in this building many times and found it neither impressive nor intimidating. "Remind me," Blackthorn said as they walked, not asking him to actually recite it, checking Harry's confidence. "The 1798 provision is our strongest statute for the base argument," Harry said. "The absent trial documentation is the evidentiary foundation. They cannot argue procedure when there was no procedure. The blood acceptance doctrine supports my standing to bring the petition. And if the Wisingamot attempts procedural delay today, we invoke the expedited review mechanism under the Noble House Charter and request an immediate ruling on the documentation gap. And if Crouch speaks, he'll defend the wartime emergency powers. I don't argue with the powers, I argue with their application past the emergency period. The emergency powers expired when Voldemort fell. Sirius was held in peacetime conditions without peacetime protections." Blackthorn looked at him sideways. "You should have been a solicitor." "I'm 11, Harry said. "Give it time," Blackthorn said. The Wisingamot chamber was circular, tiered seating, the kind of room that communicated its function through its geometry, the accused at the center, the apparatus of judgment arranged around and above. Harry had read about it. Sitting in it was different from reading about it, because the room had weight to it, the weight of every proceeding that had ever happened here, justice and injustice distributed across 2 centuries of use. The Wisingamot's preliminary bench for the hearing was 9 members, which Blackthorn had told him was standard for preliminary review. They filed in with the robes and the deliberate pace of people performing institutional authority, and Harry looked at them one by one and catalogued what he saw. Madame Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, she had a monocle and the careful precision of someone who had spent 30 years trying to do the right thing within a system that frequently made that difficult. She looked at Harry when she sat and held his gaze for a moment with something that was not warmth but was a genuine commitment to fairness, which was considerably more useful. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, soft around the edges in the way of men who had arrived at power through the management of other people's discomfort rather than through conviction, currently wearing the specific look of someone who would very much prefer to be somewhere else. Bartemius Crouch Sr., older than his file suggested, with the tight, controlled bearing of a man who had built his self-image on the quality of his decisions and was sitting in a room where one of them was about to be formally examined. The remaining 6 were names Harry recognized from the ledger of Noble House bonds and alliance records, a mixed group, moderate and traditional families, none of them presenting obvious hostility and none of them presenting obvious support, which was exactly the neutral ground a preliminary hearing should occupy. Dumbledore was in the upper gallery, not at the bench, observing, as he'd been asked. He met Harry's eyes once, briefly, and then looked away. The matter before this bench, the presiding member, a witch named Griselda Marchbanks, who looked approximately as old as magic itself, announced, is the petition filed by Lord H. J. Potter Peverell, Lord Black, requesting review of the incarceration of Sirius Orion Black, formerly Lord Black, detained November 1981 and held at Azkaban prison without trial. The chamber was very quiet. Lord Black, Marchbanks said, and it took Harry half a beat to register she was addressing him. "You may proceed." Harry stood. He didn't think about how old he was. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban for 11 years and about what his mother's letter had said and about the 2 days between arrest and imprisonment in a document signed by a man currently sitting at the bench, and then he spoke. "Thank you, Madam Marchbanks." He looked at the bench with the same steady attention he gave everything. "The petition is straightforward in its foundation. The Ministry has been asked to produce trial documentation for the incarceration of Sirius Black. They have produced arrest documentation dated November 1st, 1981 and transfer documentation dated November 3rd, 1981. Between those two dates there is no record of a hearing, no record of a veritaserum examination, no record of legal representation, and no record of any Weisengamot proceeding of any kind. He paused. Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 11 years and 2 months. He was placed there in 2 days. The question before this bench is not whether Sirius Black is guilty of the crimes he was accused of. The question is whether a man accused of crimes can be imprisoned without being asked whether he committed them. Crouch moved. His posture had not changed but his jaw had. The wartime emergency provisions, Fudge started. Were active in November 1981, Harry said. Yes, Minister. They were also specific in their scope. They authorized expedited detention and expedited hearing, not the elimination of hearing. I've cited the relevant statute in the brief, page 9, section 3, paragraph 2. He looked at Fudge steadily. Emergency detention without hearing was authorized for a period of 48 hours to allow for the gathering of evidence prior to expedited trial. Not for the permanent replacement of trial. The 48 hours was used for transfer rather than for the evidence gathering it was intended to permit. Mr. Crouch acted under extremely difficult circumstances. Fudge tried again. I'm sure he did, Harry said, and meant it. I'm not asking this bench to condemn Mr. Crouch. I'm asking this bench to correct the procedural consequence of a decision made under pressure in a difficult time. Those are different things. He looked at Crouch directly. A veritaserum hearing. That's all. Give Sirius Black what he should have been given in November 1981. Let him answer the accusations under veritaserum, in a proper hearing, with representation. He paused. If he's guilty, the hearing will confirm it. The incarceration stands. But we will know. And if he isn't guilty, if the evidence says something different than the accusation, then 11 years in Azkaban is already a harm this institution cannot undo, and the least it can do is stop. The chamber was very quiet. Bones had not moved during the entire address. She sat with her monocle and her careful attention and looked at Harry with an expression that was very controlled and very specific, the expression of someone who had known something was wrong for years and had been waiting for the correct lever. Lord Black, she said. The documentation you refer to on page 9, your brief cites a 1798 provision I was not previously aware of. Can you speak to its standing? The 1798 Noble House Protection Act, Harry said. Pre-ministry. It was superseded in some provisions by the ministry's founding charter in 1811 but remains active in its core clause regarding the rights of noble house members during extraordinary circumstances, specifically because the ministry's founding charter did not explicitly repeal it but rather supplemented it. The provision survived in the gap between the two legislative documents. It establishes an absolute right to Weisengamot hearing for any member of a recognized noble house regardless of the procedural conditions of arrest, including wartime emergency provisions. Bones looked at Blackthorne, then back at Harry. How did you find this provision? Extensive reading, Harry said. Something moved in Bones' expression that was the closest she'd come to a smile. Crouch stood. The room shifted attention to him with the specific alertness of an audience watching a moment they've been waiting for. I will speak to the circumstances of the arrest, Crouch said. His voice was what Harry had expected, controlled, certain, the voice of a man who had always been the cleverest person in the room. In November 1981 the wizarding world was in chaos. We had just lost a war, let me be clear to any who have forgotten, that killed dozens, destroyed families, terrorized the community for a decade. Sirius Black was identified at the scene, admitted by eyewitness account to have been the Potter's secret keeper, and was found by Aurors in a street full of dead muggles. The speed of the decision, Mr. Crouch, Harry said. Crouch stopped. The interruption of a Weisengamot address was technically a procedural violation, and everyone in the room knew it, and everyone in the room also noted that Harry said it without aggression, without drama, with the simple directness of someone noting a fact. I'm going to ask you a question, Harry said. And I want to be clear that I'm not asking it to trap you. I'm asking because it's the question the hearing needs answered. He held Crouch's gaze. Was Sirius Black ever asked whether he was the Potter's secret keeper? In any documented, formal proceeding? Was he ever directly asked that question under any circumstance that produced a record? Crouch was silent. The eyewitness account you cite, Harry said, describes what witnesses saw. Not what Sirius Black said. Not what a formal examination produced. There are people in this room right now who have spent months, I've spent months, trying to find a single document in which Sirius Black was asked the question he's been in prison for the answer to. He paused. There isn't one. Crouch's face had gone very still. The stillness of a man looking directly at something he has been not looking at for 11 years. A Veritaserum hearing, Harry said again. Not demanding. Asking. Let him answer. The bench retired to deliberate for 40 minutes. Harry sat with Blackthorne in an antechamber that had green wallpaper and a portrait of some historical wizard who kept pretending to be asleep. Blackthorne read through the brief again. Harry looked at his hands, healed, unmarked, and thought about Sirius in a cell, and thought about the thread through the black ring, and thought about the letter he'd sent that may or may not have arrived with enough of its meaning intact. You handled the Crouch exchange correctly, Blackthorne said, not looking up. I meant it, Harry said. I'm not after him. Not today. I know. That's why it was correct. Blackthorne turned a page. Bones will push for the hearing. She's been wanting to push for it for years. There have been 3 previous inquiries that went nowhere because no one had standing to compel the documentation. You have standing. She'll use you. Good, Harry said. I'll use the outcome. Blackthorne looked up at that, and the expression on his face was something Harry thought might be professional admiration, which from a man of Blackthorne's age and experience felt significant. When they went back in, Marchbanks delivered the bench's ruling with the unhurried precision of someone for whom words were instruments requiring exact placement. The petition is upheld in its core argument, she said. The absence of trial documentation for the incarceration of Sirius Orion Black represents a procedural inadequacy that this bench cannot in good conscience allow to stand. The bench hereby orders a full hearing, with Veritaserum examination, to be conducted within 30 days. Sirius Black is to be transferred from Azkaban to Ministry Holding, under appropriate security, pending that hearing. All rights afforded to noble house members under applicable statute are to be restored effective immediately. Fudge looked like he was managing several feelings simultaneously and not succeeding at any of them. Crouch's face was entirely still. Bones was writing something with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting to write this particular order for years. Harry said nothing. He looked at the bench and felt the black ring warm against his hand and thought, coming. I'm coming. Hold on a little longer. The holding facility where Sirius was transferred was not Azkaban, but it was not comfortable, and when Harry arrived, accompanied by Blackthorne, by Bones herself, and by 2 Aurors whose body language suggested they found the entire situation procedurally unprecedented, he was prepared, in a general way, for what he might find. He was not entirely prepared for Sirius Black. The man who looked up when the door opened was thin in the way of people who have been thin for a long time, so that the thinness was structural rather than incidental. His hair was long and tangled and gray at the temples despite him being only 33 years old. But his eyes, gray, sharp, black family eyes, were present. Damaged and cautious and very wary, but there. Not the vacant dissociation Harry had feared. He looked at Harry standing in the doorway and went completely still. You got my letter, Harry said. A long silence. Sirius Black's eyes went to the rings on Harry's hands and something moved in his face, something that had been sealed for 11 years under the pressure of Azkaban and whatever remained of the Dementor's particular cruelty, cracking open slowly, the way ice cracks in spring. Harry, Sirius said. His voice was rough with disuse. You look like James. People keep saying that, Harry said. I'm told I have Mum's eyes. You do, Sirius said. Both of them. Which makes you, he stopped. His hands, clasped on the table in front of him, were trembling slightly. I got your letter, he said. I read it 6 times. The paper fell apart, I read it so many times. Harry crossed the room and sat across from him, and Blackthorn and Bones stayed near the door with the tact of people who understood that some things didn't need an audience. There's going to be a hearing, Harry said. 30 days. Veritaserum. You'll be asked about the secret keeper. Peter was the secret keeper, Sirius said immediately, with a flat certainty. We switched. Last minute. My idea. I thought, he stopped. I thought I was too obvious a choice. That Voldemort would come for me first. I thought Peter was safe. A sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He was their man the whole time. He faked his death when I cornered him and I don't know where he is. He could be anywhere. He's a rat, Harry said. Sirius stared at him. Literally, Harry said. He's an animagus. He's been living as Ron Weasley's pet rat for the past year. Which I know because the Black family magic can track unregistered animagi who have significant interactions with Black family members, and Peter Pettigrew interacted quite significantly with your family for a long time. He paused. Blackthorn has filed a secondary petition for Pettigrew's investigation. The Aurors have been notified. Sirius was looking at Harry with an expression that had moved past several recognizable emotions and arrived somewhere without a clear name, something vast and raw and grateful and barely contained. You're 11 years old, Sirius said. Everyone keeps noting that, Harry said. A sound came out of Sirius, cracked and sudden and real, the first laugh that had come out of him in years, and it sounded like breaking and rebuilding happening simultaneously. He pressed a hand over his eyes and the laugh broke into something else for a moment and then came back to itself. James, he said, to the table, or to nobody, or to the air. James, look at your kid. Harry waited. There was no rush. After a moment Sirius lowered his hand and looked at Harry with eyes that were red at the edges and absolutely clear. What do you need from me, he said. For the hearing. What do I do? Answer the questions, Harry said. Tell the truth. The Veritaserum will do the rest. He paused. And then, after the hearing, after the verdict, I want to know if you want the guardianship. My fathers will name you. My solicitor can file for formal magical guardianship within a week of your clearance. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. You'd want that, he said carefully. You don't know me. Not really. You've read about me, I've had 11 years of wanting someone who was actually mine, Harry said simply. You knew my parents. You knew them when they were alive and you loved them and they trusted you with me. That's more than I've had from anyone who's actually been present. He met Sirius's eyes. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. You've been in Azkaban for 11 years and you need to recover and that's going to take time and it's going to be hard. I'm asking whether you want to try. Sirius Black looked at him across the table in a ministry holding facility with Azkaban still in his hands and his eyes and the way he held his shoulders, and said, yes. God, yes. Good, Harry said. The Veritaserum hearing happened in 26 days, not 30. Blackthorn had the specific skill of a man who knows exactly which procedural mechanisms can be accelerated and which cannot, and he drove the preparation with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 40 years and intended to do it perfectly. Harry went to school on the intervening days and attended classes and ate meals and had a snowball fight with Neville and Ron that escalated into something genuinely elaborate involving the twins and half of Gryffindor House, and Hermione helped him with the French translation for a charms theory question he'd initially misread, and all of it was real and present and good. He visited Sirius twice more in the holding facility. The visits were different from the first one, less raw, more ordinary, two people finding the shape of how to know each other. Sirius asked about Harry's classes with the focused attention of someone who had been deprived of ordinary information for a long time and found it intensely interesting. Harry asked about his parents, the ordinary things, the things the mirror couldn't tell him. What his father's laugh sounded like. Whether his mother had been as terrifyingly organized as her letter suggested. Whether James Potter had been a genuinely good Quidditch player or whether that was family legend. Both, Sirius said. He was brilliantly good and the legend is also accurate, which was insufferable but you got used to it. A pause. You're better than he was. Just so you know. How would you know? You've been in, I heard about your first Quidditch match, Sirius said. Bones Auror told me. 32 minutes, clean catch, didn't show off once. He looked at Harry. James showed off constantly. It was part of the charm. He searched for the word. You just do it. Like it's the natural state of things. Harry looked at the table. Mum apparently, he said. God, yes, Sirius said, with a smile that was painful and warm in equal measure. Lily did everything like it was the natural state of things. Made the rest of us look like we were trying too hard. The hearing itself was formal and swift in the way that things are swift when the work has been done beforehand. Sirius answered every question under Veritaserum with the flat certainty of truth. He was not the secret keeper. He did not betray the Potters. Peter Pettigrew switched roles at Sirius's suggestion and betrayed the location and faked his death when Sirius confronted him. Sirius Black had killed no one. Peter Pettigrew, retrieved from the Weasley household 2 days before the hearing by Aurors operating on Blackthorn's secondary petition, had been examined separately and had confirmed every detail, in the way that people confirm things when Veritaserum leaves no alternative. The 12 Muggles had been killed by Pettigrew's own curse, turned back on the bystanders when he'd severed his own finger and transformed. The verdict took 11 minutes. Innocent. All charges dismissed. Full restoration of rights and status. Fudge read it with the expression of a man eating something he doesn't like but cannot spit out. Bones read it with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this specific moment for years and intends to remember every detail of it. Harry sat next to Blackthorn and watched Sirius receive the verdict and felt the black ring pulse once, warm and certain, and thought, there. That's what this was for. They were in the Ministry atrium afterward, waiting for the flu, when Dumbledore arrived. He walked across the atrium with his usual unhurried grace and stopped in front of Sirius with an expression that was, genuinely difficult. That specific quality of a man who knows he is not owed forgiveness and is not asking for it but is present anyway, which is its own kind of honesty. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Sirius Black had 11 years of Azkaban in his eyes and the very specific knowledge that Dumbledore had said nothing in 1981 when saying something might have mattered, and all of that was visible and real and Dumbledore did not look away from it. Albus, Sirius said finally. Sirius, Dumbledore said. I should have, he stopped. Started again. There is nothing adequate I can say. No, Sirius agreed. A silence. I should have fought for you, Dumbledore said. At the time. I had doubts and I managed them rather than acted on them. I was managing too many things. A pause. That is an explanation. Not an excuse. Sirius looked at him for a moment longer. I know the difference, he said. Come and have tea with me sometime. Not today. But sometime. He paused. I want to know what happened while I was gone. You're the only one who saw all of it. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment in the way of someone recalibrating. Yes, he said. I'd like that very much. He looked at Harry then, and Harry looked back, and between them passed the specific understanding of a relationship that was neither simple nor resolved but was, something. A work in progress. Two people who had each decided the other was worth continued engagement. Your mother, Dumbledore said to Harry, would have been extraordinary to watch today. I know, Harry said. She would also, Dumbledore said, with something very close to warmth, have had significant opinions about several of your methodological choices. I know that too, Harry said. Dumbledore smiled and it reached his eyes, and this time the complexity of it, all the history and regret and genuine regard mixed into the expression, was visible rather than managed, and Harry thought that this, too, was progress. The return to Hogwarts that evening had the quality of a breath let out. Harry walked into the great hall for dinner and the school noticed his return in the ambient, distributed way of enclosed communities, a shift in the energy, several pairs of eyes, the Gryffindor table's particular brightening as Hermione and Neville registered him coming through the doors. He sat down and someone put a plate in front of him and the noise of dinner resumed around him like water closing over a stone. Well? Hermione said, with the controlled precision of someone who had been waiting 6 hours to ask this question. Innocent, Harry said. All charges dismissed. Sirius is free. Hermione pressed her lips together for a moment and then exhaled and looked at the table. Neville made a sound that was not quite a word. Ron, on Hermione's other side, hit the table once with his fist, not hard, just the physical expression of an emotion that needed somewhere to go. Peter Pettigrew? Neville said. Arrested. Charged. In ministry custody. Harry picked up his fork. They'll hold a full trial. It'll take months. And Sirius is? He's going to his family home to start with, Harry said. Number 12, Grimmauld Place. He needs time. He's okay, but Azkaban takes a long time to come back from. He paused. The formal guardianship filing is with Blackthorn. It should be finalized before the end of term. Hermione looked at him. How do you feel, she asked, quietly, cutting under the information. Harry thought about it honestly, because she asked honest questions and deserved honest answers. Like several things that have been moving for a long time have landed, he said. Like I can breathe differently. There's still a lot to do. But this specific piece, he shook his head. It's done. He's out. Good, Neville said quietly, with the weight of someone for whom out and free and safe were words carrying personal history. Harry looked at Neville and thought, not for the first time, that whatever had been buried in this boy under years of being told he wasn't enough was something worth watching grow. He was different now from September. Not fundamentally changed, still Neville, still earnest and honest and sometimes uncertain, but something had straightened in him, some internal posture had shifted. His herbology work was genuinely excellent. His charms had improved dramatically. He'd stood up to Draco Malfoy in the corridor last week with a quiet, factual calmness that had left Draco with nothing useful to say. Draco Malfoy, for his part, had been a study in ongoing recalibration all term. He was still Slytherin. Still Malfoy. Still capable of being cutting and dismissive in the reflexive way of someone whose primary defense mechanism was contempt. But the contempt had gaps in it now, places where other things showed through, genuine curiosity about magic, a capacity for precision that his house's worst qualities kept suppressing, and occasional moments in which he appeared to forget he was supposed to be adversarial and simply engaged with something on its own terms. He hadn't insulted Hermione in 3 weeks. Harry had noticed. He suspected Hermione had noticed. He suspected Draco knew they'd noticed and found this information complicated. The letter from Sirius arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the verdict. It was written in the slightly uncertain hand of someone relearning how to do things they'd done automatically before, the handwriting of a man who had not written many letters in 11 years. It was 4 pages long, and it was not about the legal situation or the guardianship paperwork or any of the administrative facts of their correspondence. It was about James Potter. About the specific, ordinary details of a friendship that had been the defining relationship of Sirius Black's life, the way James laughed, the terrible jokes, the absolute and occasionally inconvenient loyalty that had made him both wonderful and exhausting. The Marauders. Moony and Wormtail and Prongs, before Wormtail had become something else entirely. The letter ended with, I've been sitting in this house for 3 weeks and I keep expecting it to feel like being home and it doesn't yet because home is not a building, I know that. But here's the thing, Harry, here's what I keep thinking about. You wrote me a letter in December. In Azkaban. And you told me you were doing all right, and I believed you, and I thought, he's okay, James's kid is okay, he's more than okay, he's something none of us could have predicted, and that was the thing that got me through the next 6 weeks until the verdict. Not the legal process. Not the hope. You, specifically. The fact of you. So. What I'm saying is, thank you. And also, I'm coming to Hogwarts in March for the Gryffindor-Ravenclaw match. Bones says I'm allowed out. McGonagall says I'm allowed in. I've been informed you're a seeker and I find this information deeply emotionally affecting. Your godfather, Sirius, Padfoot. I'll explain later. Harry read the letter at the breakfast table and then read it again and then folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his robes, against his chest. Ron looked at him. Good news? Yes, Harry said. He finished breakfast and went to his first class of the day, which was Transfiguration, and McGonagall was mid-lesson on more complex object-to-object transformations and called on him to demonstrate the theory and he did, precisely and without difficulty, and she gave him a look of approval that had warmth in it. Walking to Charms afterward, Neville fell into step beside him on the wide staircase. Harry, Neville said. I wanted to tell you something. Tell me. I've been practicing the dueling spells from the second-year standard text, Neville said. On my own, in the evenings. In the common room when nobody's there. He said it with the particular care of someone sharing something they've only recently begun to trust themselves with. Not because of any specific, just. I want to be better. I want to be someone who can, if something happens. To the people I care about. I want to be useful. Harry looked at him. You're already useful, he said. More useful, Neville said. Better. Then I'll practice with you, Harry said. Saturday mornings. Ask Hermione too, she'll want in. Neville nodded slowly and the something that had been straightening in him since September straightened a little further, and Harry thought that this specific thing, this incremental building of a person into the fullest version of themselves, was the thing he'd do the most good at. Not the legal work, not the confrontations, not the strategic management of large institutional forces. This. Standing next to people who were becoming and making it easier for them to do so. The staircase swung to the right as they walked, as Hogwarts staircases did. Harry let it take him where it was going. The last evening of term was warm for February, with the specific brightness of a Scottish late afternoon that was not quite spring but was pointing toward it, and Harry sat on the front steps of the castle in the late light with Hermione on one side and Neville on the other, and the grounds were below them and the lake was silver in the distance and somewhere in the forest something moved with the patient authority of a creature who has always known where it belongs. What happens next year? Hermione said. She was looking at the grounds, not at Harry, the way she asked things she'd been thinking about for a while. More school, Harry said. The Wisengamot. The Pettigrew trial. The serious guardianship. The outstanding investigation into the compulsion charm. The ongoing question of Voldemort's dispersal, and what that means for where he goes next. She counted them off without urgency. That's a lot for a second year. We'll manage, Harry said. I know we will, she said. I just want to make sure you know it's we. I know. She looked at him then, properly, with that careful attention. Good, she said. Just checking. Neville said nothing, which was sometimes the most Neville thing he did, just being present, solid and warm, the specific comfort of someone whose loyalty was not a performance. Harry looked at the grounds below, at the evening coming in, at the castle at his back which had been his home for 5 months and already felt like it had always been that. The black ring was warm. The Peverell ring was warm. Something vast and patient at the very edge of awareness, not threatening, not imposing, present, the way it had always been present, the way he was learning it would always be present. Not death as ending. Death as the deepest structure of the world, the thing that made all the rest of it real and weighted and worth the effort. He thought of his mother writing a letter in the dark knowing she might not survive to see whether it arrived. He thought of Sirius in Azkaban reading a piece of paper until it fell apart. He thought of Neville's parents in Street Mungos, still present in the world, still unresolved, and of the Black Lestrange connection that had not been addressed yet but would be, when the time was right, when he had the standing and the knowledge and the appropriate lever. He hadn't forgotten. He wouldn't forget. He thought of Draco Malfoy sitting with the prophet open to the wrong page, doing the slow and painful work of questioning what he'd been given to believe, which was not heroism but was something else, the harder thing, the thing that required more of a person than heroism usually did. He thought of Tom Riddle, scattered and dispersed and not finished, somewhere out in the dark, anchoring and rebuilding with the terrible patience of diminished things that refused to accept their diminishment. He thought of everything that was still unresolved and everything that was still coming and everything that needed doing, and held all of it in the same awareness without flinching from any of it. He was 11 years old. He was lord of 2 ancient houses, carrying an inheritance older than almost anything else in Britain, connected to the deep structure of magic through a bloodline that had been waiting a very long time for someone to use it properly. He had 3 people who were genuinely, freely, completely his. He had a godfather who was free. He had a school that was home. He had his mother's clarity and his father's absolute refusal to be moved and the Peverell patience that had settled into him like a coal-catching light on the first night he'd put on the rings, warm and present and entirely unconcerned with what any particular person thought of it. He was not afraid of what was coming. He was, in fact, rather looking forward to it. The evening light settled over the grounds and the lake went from silver to gold and the castle's first lights came on in the windows above and behind him, and Harry Potter sat on the steps of Hogwarts in the last of the day's warmth and let the world be exactly what it was. It was, he thought, a very good start.